grew up in Scarsdale, New York, and I've been drawing and painting since I could hold a brush. Specifically, I love working with watercolor. I was very fortunate in the sense that my parents were able to give me a lifetime of support, supplies, and private art classes. That kind of upbringing gave me opportunities that I'm fully aware most people don't get. After college, I had the financial means and, most importantly, the time to focus on being a full-time artist. I know how lucky that makes me, and I've never taken it for granted. Because of that freedom, I've been able to travel and paint for long periods of time. In the last 10 years, though, I've become especially fond of going completely off-grid where I can be alone for days at a time with no phones or distractions or pressure. I love quietly being in nature, and I feel that my best work comes out when I can do that. When I travel these days, I usually find a small rental house or take my RV, which I absolutely love. In October of 2021, I was on one of these trips. I was staying at a vacation home owned by my father's friend in Dedham, Maine, and I'd been working on a series of paintings that showcased New England in the fall. I drove up to Dedham from New York and had no time constraints with the house, as their family only used it in the summer. I had planned on being there for about a week, but I could have stayed longer if I needed to. The house itself was far more than enough. I think it had 4 or 5 bedrooms, and normally I'd never stay somewhere like that, but I also knew it was surrounded by private land without a neighbor in sight, and creatively I thought that was perfect. There's something about isolation that clears my head like nothing else can. The day I got there, I unpacked and mostly walked around the property, but I didn't paint at all, which was normal. I like having a full day to settle into a new place and get the lay of the land, and the autumn colors had been near their peak. That night I went to bed perfectly calm and happy to be there. On that first night, I couldn't have slept any better, but I had a vivid dream about my brother and sister showing up to the house in the middle of the night. I remember opening the front door and being shocked and excited to see them standing there, because they live in different states and the 3 of us are rarely together at one time. It didn't make any logical sense, but like any dream, you don't question it. They stayed outside on the patio and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I put my coat and shoes on and walked with them around the property. Specifically, we went into the woods behind the house together to look at the fall foliage, even though it was still nighttime in my dream. None of the details made sense, but I was happy to be with my siblings. When I woke up, I remember thinking it was a very odd dream to have, but a good one. The next few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent hours outside painting with warm cups of tea, and the weather was incredible for October. I barely spoke out loud and was completely in my head in the best way. The only thing that was slightly distracting me was my sleep. I continued to dream that my brother and sister were coming to the house. It wasn't the same every time, but they would always show up at night and knock on the door, and every time they would ask me to come outside with them. The first time had been to walk, and another time they needed help bringing things in from their car. I started to think I was causing them to happen by overthinking and latching on to the first dream. By the 4th night, I was close to getting my phone out of the car to call them. I felt like I was having some kind of premonition or something was wrong. I wasn't particularly scared by it, just a little uncomfortable, and I was thinking about it a lot. I had never dreamt about the same thing more than once like that. Around 11 o'clock that night, I was reading on a big leather chair in the main room of the house because I was having a hard time sleeping. The gas fireplace was on and the house was quiet. Then I could have sworn I heard the back door gently close. This door was through the kitchen, and it wasn't a loud noise, but it was a distinct click that sounded like the latch, and it immediately scared me. Like anyone would, I thought someone had walked into the house. I jumped off the chair, terrified to really do anything. Then I picked up the closest object I could find, which was a rock from this bowl of decorative river rocks and candles on the coffee table, and walked toward the kitchen. I had stayed alone like this for years, and I had never had anything happen before. The idea of someone coming through the gated driveway and into the house was incredibly scary. When I could see there wasn't anyone in the kitchen, I checked the door and it was still locked, which made me feel a lot better. Nothing looked like it had been touched, and after standing there for a minute and listening, I thought it had to be another noise from the house I wasn't familiar with. After that minor heart attack, I went back to the chair in the living room to try and calm down again. Maybe a half hour later, I did calm down and was finally feeling tired enough to sleep. I was still reading, but I could feel myself dozing off, and I was thinking about going upstairs to bed. That was when I heard another noise that I thought was a mouse. It sounded like something small moving on the floor around the side of the fireplace. The living room of this house had very large vaulted ceilings and a stone fireplace that went all the way up. The stairway to get to the bedrooms was behind the fireplace and attached to the back side of it. I remember pulling my feet up onto the chair and staring at that side of the fireplace where it went back and under the stairs. I was really waiting to see a small rodent run across the floor. Then I did see something move, but instead of it being a mouse, I saw an arm and a hand come from around the back of the fireplace and into the light. I completely froze in the chair with a level of terror that is indescribable. The only explanation for what was happening is that someone else was in the house. I literally couldn't move, not even to pick up the rock again. I pushed myself back into the chair with my feet and said out loud, "Whoever is there, I have a weapon." It was the only thing I could get out, even though I had nothing. Right after I said that, the most unhuman head and upper body moved out from behind the fireplace and my entire life changed. What I was looking at had no place on this earth. Its skin was a horrible pale color with a wrinkled texture, and its face was almost featureless other than disturbingly large black eyes. There was nothing familiar about it. A fear hit me that I didn't know was possible. The only thing I remember was screaming at the top of my lungs, and then it was too much for me. My vision went into a full tunnel and I passed out. After that, I had no conception of time passing and I didn't dream. I only opened my eyes to see the smallest amount of light. It actually took me a second to understand where I was, but I hadn't moved from the chair in the living room and I was seeing the first morning light through the windows. I felt terrified and relieved at the same time because I remembered everything that had happened, but the fact that it was morning and I was still there made me think it was a nightmare. I thought I must have fallen asleep while reading and had the most vivid and horrific dream of my life. As it got brighter outside, my fear faded, but any creative energy I might have had was gone. I did not want to stay in that house another night, so I packed up and left before noon. It was really during the drive home that everything started to unravel for me. It didn't seem to matter what music I put on or what I tried to think about. It was an all-day drive and I could not get that nightmare out of my head. I was also dwelling on the dreams about my brother and sister showing up, and that's where it really went south. Every time I pictured them coming to the door, it wasn't them anymore. It was two of those horrible alien beings I saw in my nightmare. It made me realize that it hadn't actually been my siblings. I was only remembering it that way when I'd wake up instead of what was actually there. I kept thinking about putting my coat and shoes on and willingly walking with them away from the house. And once those thoughts entered my mind, I genuinely felt like they weren't dreams. It felt like I physically left the house every night and didn't know what I was doing. Another thing that I couldn't ignore was that I had been wide awake when I heard the latch on the back door. I know that happened, and even though I didn't see anything in the kitchen when I got up, I still think something came in. Over the last 4 years, I've come to believe I had a close encounter at that house. I think those beings appeared to me as family members so I would be comfortable enough to go with them. When I look back now, they feel like real experiences, not dreams. I also believe that what I saw come around the fireplace was actually there and 100% real, and I am so thankful I passed out. That was my absolute limit for fear, and my body just shut down. Another thing I'm fairly confident about is if they wanted to hurt me, they could have, so whatever their intentions might have been, I don't think they were bad. Maybe it was pure curiosity and we are just that interesting. It changed everything for me and had a major impact on my life. I have no doubts anymore about other life visiting and interacting with us. I know deep down now that these experiences people talk about are real, and nothing anyone says could ever convince me otherwise. My childhood was spent in a beautiful neighborhood full of trees and nice homes in Meadville, Pennsylvania. We were in town, but it felt like we lived in the woods because our huge front and backyards were both filled with trees and bushes. Actually, the name of the street we lived on was Forest Avenue, and I always thought that described it perfectly. When I was 8 years old, I was outside more than in, mostly in our backyard, and I remember there was an old fallen log in our backyard that I liked to sit on and play around. I was more of a tomboy back then because I liked to catch bugs and feed wildlife and play in the dirt and rocks. I really had no interest in dressing up or playing with dolls. One evening before dinner, I was in the back playing on that log and a bird landed right next to me. I didn't know what kind of bird it was then, but I do now, and it was a black-capped chickadee. All I knew is that it was small and it had cute little white cheeks on its face. It had landed on a dead branch only a foot or two away from me, and I remember trying to stay still because I didn't want to scare it and make it fly away. That same bird came back over and over again, almost daily, and I would see it all the time after that. It must have gotten very comfortable with me because it started to land on the actual log just inches away from me where I could have picked it up if I wanted to. I would always stay still though and let it do whatever it wanted to. I was pretty young, but one of the things I remember most about this little bird was that it would look right at me when I would say things to it and even tilt its head like a dog does, but it really kept eye contact. It made me feel special, like I was different or interesting, so I started bringing pieces of bread with me, and after doing that for a while, it would eat out of my hand. I don't really remember how long this went on, but after it had gotten comfortable with me feeding it, I would follow the bird when it'd jump off the log and hop back into the deeper trees. I used to think it had a family it was going back to. I know I never followed it that far away from my house, but there was a small clearing in the trees where for some reason I would lose the bird every time. So when I'd get to that spot, I would just turn around and go back to the house. This probably went on for half of the summer, so not too long, but definitely long enough to remember. Then one day, the bird stopped coming around. I'm sure I was sad about it, but I don't really remember much after that. Even though it was only a short piece of my childhood, I never forgot about the bird, and it became one of those few core memories that I always hung on to. About 4 years after this, I had another experience with the same species of bird. I woke up really early one morning, again in the summer, and it was right when the sky was starting to get light. I've never been an early riser, so this was already weird for me, but my window had been cracked open all night, and another chickadee landed on the outer windowsill, actually touching my screen, and stared into my room. I was around 12 then, so I knew it wasn't the same bird from when I was younger, but it did give me a very familiar feeling, and it stayed there watching me. It even let me come up to the screen and talk to it for a minute before it flew away. This might not sound like anything more than a random bird showing up, but to me it felt like it had deliberately come to see me, and I can't really explain why I felt that way. Those were my two experiences growing up. They weren't extraordinary or even exciting really, they were just notable encounters with the same species of bird, and that seemed unique. I carried those memories with me into my adult life, but aside from always having a place in my heart for chickadees, it was never something I thought about. About 20 years later, when I was in my early 30s, my friend and I had taken our kids up to Woodcock Lake, not far from where I grew up. We both had our kids in strollers and were on a walk later in the afternoon. Somewhere along the trail, I had stopped for a second to grab a sippy cup out of the back of the stroller for my daughter, and while I was crouched down behind it, another chickadee landed on the actual handle of the stroller. When I looked up, it was only a foot from my face. It startled me, but I smiled automatically because it felt like running into someone from my past. The friend I was with even said she saw it flying toward me and thought it was going to land on my head. I stayed there crouched on the ground and was looking at it right in the eyes, and I don't know what happened, but this massive rush of déjà vu came over me. I felt it through my entire body, and it made me remember things from when I was young, and some of the things I had never remembered until that second. The very first thing that came to me is that when I would follow this bird into the trees as a little girl, it wasn't just me curiously wandering with it, it was much more intentional. Then I got a strong feeling that that bird hadn't just appeared on its own by happenstance. It had been there on purpose and was directing me. Then a memory came into my head that I had never had before. I remembered that when I would follow it deeper into the trees, the woods around me would change. I could picture the trees perfectly spaced from each other like they were planted down a hallway, and all of the forest and neighborhood sounds would go away until it was just quiet and I was standing in that small open area. I also knew that I wasn't alone there. I don't remember seeing any faces or details. I only know that there were other larger figures around me and they were like adults. It was the strongest and strangest feeling of being surrounded by other presences that were standing still, and even as a child I understood that they were not animals or other people. It dawned on me that the bird wasn't the focus of these memories at all. The figures that were there with me were the focus, and the bird was what brought me to them. This rush of feelings was so intense that I fell back from the stroller and ended up on my butt in the gravel, which made the bird on the handle fly away. The only thought I had was, how could I have forgotten this? It was like I had always known what actually happened when I would follow the bird, but had chosen to forget it. I remember my friend coming over to help me up because she thought something was wrong, but I couldn't even begin to tell her what I was actually feeling, so I didn't say anything and tried to laugh it off like I had lost my balance. As we finished our walk, I barely remember anything between the bird landing on the stroller and getting to the car because I was so confused. I could not believe I had forgotten this giant crazy thing that used to happen every time I would follow the bird when I was young. It must have happened 10 times, and it left me with huge questions about who these figures in the forest were and what had actually happened to me. One of my best friends has heard me talk about this many times, and she wonders if there were older kids or even neighbors back there that I'm not remembering correctly. I am positive it wasn't either of those, because when I picture myself standing in that clearing, I can almost see them again, and they don't look like people. They look more like thin shadows of people, but with a presence that I can physically feel. It makes me think I was in contact with something back there. I just don't know what it was. This happened in May of 2009, the year my daughter was born, so my wife was 7 months pregnant at the time. We live in Overland Park, Kansas, and have been in the same house since 2003. Nothing happened in our house before this, and nothing has happened since. It took place over 4 consecutive nights, and during the first 3, I was waking up 4 to 5 times for absolutely no reason. Nothing was waking me like being hot or uncomfortable, and it wasn't because I had to use the bathroom. I would just open my eyes, and it was very weird for me because I'm usually a heavy sleeper with no history of insomnia or problems sleeping. Additionally, I was having extreme fatigue at work, and it wasn't a normal tiredness from losing sleep. My entire body was wiped out and dehydrated, and my legs had a deep soreness that went from my calves all the way up through my thighs and into my lower back. It felt like I had been doing days of hard physical labor, but I hadn't done anything that would cause that level of fatigue. I also thought about the possibility of a flu or similar virus, but I had no other symptoms. The 4th night happened to be a Friday, and my wife and I were in our bed with a movie on. She fell asleep 20 minutes into it while I stayed up, and just before it was over, I heard a thunderstorm moving in, so I opened our bedroom window to listen to it. When the movie ended, I turned everything off and went to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was, but I woke up in the dark again, exactly like the 3 previous nights, but with one difference. I was hearing a low rumbling outside that I assumed was the thunderstorm and probably the reason I had woken up. The window was still partially open, and after 10 or 15 seconds, I realized that the sound wasn't going away. It was constant and sounded like it was coming in waves, but I wasn't seeing any lightning flashes in our room. While this was happening, I was on my side facing my wife. She was on her back and still asleep with the blanket completely off of her body. It felt cold in our room, so I reached over to pull the blanket back onto her, and when I moved my arm, I felt something I have never felt before. Every movement I made while reaching over to her had no resistance. What I mean by that is it was like a weightlessness where I couldn't feel anything underneath me, around me, or touching my arm as I stretched it out. I pulled my arm back because of this feeling, and doing that started a momentum that made my whole body rotate like I was spinning on a rotisserie and I couldn't control it or stop. At the same time, I looked at my body and saw that I was also outside of the blankets, just like my wife. I reacted to this by trying to sit up, but the only thing I could do was pull my knees into my chest. I wasn't actually sitting up. Nothing was making sense, and I was still rotating toward the window. Then that rumbling sound got considerably louder, and it put a heavy pressure on my ears, so I covered them with my hands. My body had turned far enough toward the window that the ambient light coming in allowed me to see the end table, and when I did, the reality of what was going on hit me. My alarm clock and a magazine I'd been reading were suspended in the air, and they were about a foot above the top of the table, not touching anything. This was so confusing, but I finally understood what was happening. My wife and I were suspended in the air too, and that's why I hadn't been able to sit up or stop the rotation my body was stuck in. I got to a point where I was facing down and looking at the bed underneath me. Then it was total lights out. After that, I have no idea what happened. I wasn't awake or conscious again until morning. When I did wake up, there was bright sun coming in the window, and I heard a neighbor's lawnmower outside. I couldn't have been more relieved to see daylight, but at the same time, I hadn't forgotten a second of what happened. When I got out of bed, the soreness in my legs was even worse than the other days, so I took some Advil and got in the shower. I called my wife into the bathroom and told her everything I've just described, but somehow she didn't experience anything. She didn't hear or see a thing and didn't wake up at any point in the night. She only knew that we had started a movie. Currently, she does believe that I went through something, but is on the fence about what it was. I think she's 50-50 on whether something actually happened or I dreamt the whole thing. Luckily, a pretty convincing piece of evidence showed up after my shower that morning, and I'm glad it did because I was starting to think it had all been in my head. When I walked back into our bedroom to get dressed, I went to my side of the bed and found my alarm clock on its side. It was not upright. This is a big deal in my opinion because it's a larger old-school alarm clock that my parents got me when I was a kid. Some people might actually remember it too. It's a Sony Dream Machine and I still have it. There is no way that alarm clock accidentally fell onto its side because it's a large, heavy cube. To me, it proves that I wasn't dreaming, and I think it fell back down onto the table like that after being suspended in the air. The other reason my gut tells me this was real is that it all stopped after that fourth night. I completely stopped waking up at night, and the exhaustion and leg pain were gone within a few days. Nothing ever happened again. I don't know what we went through, but my wife and I, along with some of the objects around us, were lifted into the air as if Earth's gravity was turned off, and after that, who knows what could have taken place. I'm grateful my wife didn't wake up like I did, but it's hard not being able to talk to her about it on the same level. I guess more than anything, it just makes me feel alone in this experience. When I was in college, I went on a last-minute one-night camping trip with 5 of my friends. A guy named Greg, who I've known since grade school, drove, and we all crammed into his old 4Runner with our stuff. There was a 2-mile hike to get into where we wanted to camp, so we tried to pack light by only bringing 3 tents. That way we could double up with 2 people per tent. One of my other friends, Justin, threw in an unopened 6-pack of beer, and this was a 6-pack of cans that were in a box. He did that so we could each have 1 beer that night, then toss the box in the fire and smash the cans for easy carrying on the way out. By the time we drove out there, hiked in and got to the campsite, it was just starting to get dark, so the tents went up first. Then we all gathered around the fire pit on these 2 big logs that were in an L shape and ate whatever we had brought for dinner. Somewhere during that time, Justin walked around and handed each one of us a beer, which plays an important part in what happened later, but I didn't know it yet. After that, we just hung out and talked. About an hour after it had gotten dark, Greg's girlfriend Brooke loudly said something about a plane being on fire and was pointing up above us. Everyone looked at the same time, and I personally remember how weird it was seeing this for the first time. There was some kind of dark aircraft literally sitting still above where we were camped, and it had a long red light going across the underside of it. This is such a hard thing to explain, but that light on the bottom would get brighter and dimmer, and every time it got brighter, it would let out this large glowing half circle of red light around itself. It was like a burst, and we could see it stay in the air, then it would fade out after a couple of seconds. We watched one burst come out right after another for a minute straight, and none of us had a clue what it was. I don't know why Brooke thought it was a plane on fire because it didn't look anything like that. Greg thought it was a helicopter shooting out flares or something along those lines, but it was dead quiet, which makes me think that couldn't be right. Then it abruptly stopped and went pitch dark, so I don't know if it flew away or what happened. It was definitely one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, but it was short-lived, and after it happened, we just kind of went back to what we'd been doing. About half an hour after that, we were sitting around the fire and I started to feel nauseous and a little lightheaded. When it first hit me, I thought it might be dehydration, so I started drinking water. But then on top of it, I was feeling this mental fog. That's probably the best term I can come up with for how it felt. It was really weird though, because I had only eaten a small sandwich that night and had one beer. I couldn't think of anything else that would have made me sick all of a sudden. I happened to be sitting next to one of my best friends, Natalie, and I let her know I didn't feel good. Then I got up off the log because the smoke was making my nausea worse. I remember walking around to the opposite side of the fire and looking back at everyone sitting there. Justin was by himself on the log to my left, and Natalie, Greg, and Brooke were on the other log to my right. As I was watching this scene of my friends in kind of a daze, I got this disturbing feeling that something was wrong. I was still trying not to throw up at the time, but the mental fog was making the whole situation look like a dream. Then this distant question came into my mind as I was looking at the group. Why are there only 4 people? When I had this thought, I mentally did a left to right head count. Justin, Natalie, Greg, and Brooke. Then there was me, so 5 in total. In that moment, I was extremely confused and almost disoriented. I could have sworn we had another person with us, and it was making me feel like I was either on something or losing my mind. I was second guessing myself too, like, what are you talking about? Of course there were only 5 of us. But at the same time, it was like I knew that was wrong. I was trying to go back through the day in my head because it just felt like we were missing someone, and I could not think of who it was. I know this sounds like a crazy person talking, and let me tell you, I felt like one. I just had this bizarre gut feeling there was someone else with us for the entire trip, and now they were gone. I don't know how to explain it, and I couldn't even attach a face to it. Right in the middle of this mental crisis, my nausea got really bad and I had to run into the trees to throw up. Weirdly, after I did that, I almost immediately felt better physically and mentally. I have no idea why it helped so much. I just know that afterward I was like 99% back to normal. After that happened, I came back to the group and sat next to Natalie. She had seen me get sick, so she had her hand on my back to make sure I was okay. I didn't say anything at first, then I finally asked her if anyone else had come up there with us. I don't think she understood what I meant by that, so I looked right at her and bluntly said, I thought there were 6 of us. What I will never forget is that instead of immediately telling me no, she actually had to look around the campsite before answering. It wasn't even on purpose, it was totally automatic, like she was checking without realizing she was doing it. When she looked back at me, all she said was, wait a second. I could tell immediately that she felt it too. Then she asked out loud to the whole group if someone had left, and everyone stopped talking to look around. It actually scares me when I picture that moment because nobody laughed or acted like it was a dumb question. Everybody seemed genuinely unsure for a second. That set off a group conversation so ridiculous we couldn't help but laugh about it, and it went on for the rest of the night. Justin and Brooke were totally sure there had only ever been 5 of us, and they thought it was insane to even question that. Natalie, Greg, and I didn't feel that way. We thought something was off, even though none of us knew exactly what it was. One very interesting part of the conversation came when I brought up the 6-pack because I specifically remembered Justin saying each person would have 1. He says he never said that and was sure someone drank 2 beers, but no one claimed that 6th can. The tents also came up, and I remembered our discussion about 2 people in each tent. That part seemed to make so much sense to me, and I could have sworn I had it in my mind that no one would have to sleep alone. Justin chimed in again and said he brought his own tent and was always going to be by himself. Every explanation seemed to almost fit but never totally added up. That's why the whole thing was so weird. There wasn't a specific person we were missing. It just felt like we were short, and there were these little discrepancies that partially backed that up. Obviously, there were only 5 of us sitting there around the fire, but I couldn't stop feeling like we'd had one more with us that day. And I know Natalie and Greg at least partly felt the same way. When we finally stopped talking about it and went to bed, I slept perfectly fine for some reason. Natalie and I shared a tent, and I not only fell asleep the second I laid down, but I slept like a baby. In the morning, everything felt mostly back to normal and everyone seemed to be in a good mood. We didn't do much more than hang out in the woods for a while, then we hiked back to the car and drove home. The problem is, this never went away for me. Later that same year, Greg flipped his opinion completely. If it ever came up, he would side with Brooke and say he never really felt like there were 6 of us. I also don't think it hit Natalie as hard as it did me because she stays pretty quiet, but at least she hasn't changed her mind. She doesn't know what happened, but she knows something did, and she's told me in private that after I brought it up that night, she felt it too. This is pretty far out there, I know, and I hope I've written it well enough to understand. I think about that trip a lot and wonder all kinds of crazy things, like maybe we really are in a simulation and we experienced a glitch. I do have another thought that bothers me the most though, and I don't know why I always go back to this. I wonder if we had a close encounter and whatever we saw above our camp that night was them. Then I think if that's true, they either did something to us and that's what made me sick, or even worse, they actually took one of us and we don't remember. In my opinion, when Natalie asked if someone had left the group, it should have been an easy and immediate no, or it shouldn't have been a question at all. But the fact that everyone had to stop and think about it for a second proves they all felt it to some degree, and that would never be the case normally. On the surface, I will say we had a very strange thing happen to us in the woods and leave it at that. In my gut though, I could swear there was a 6th person with us right up to the point where we saw that thing in the sky. Then somehow we were down to 5, like one of us had just been erased, including the memories everyone else had of them. I can't explain it, and I don't know why it affected me the most. I still can't picture a face or come up with a name, but I have these little pieces of someone else being with us, and it's enough to make me think that I could be right. I was born and raised in Salina, Kansas, and in 2007 I was 23 years old. At that point in my life, everything felt like it was on track. I had been with my boyfriend for 3 years and we lived in a house that he had bought from his parents. We were both working and there had even been casual conversation about marriage. It really felt like life was moving in the right direction. Then something happened that changed all of it. I am going to say this in the most G-rated way I can, but in the spring of that year, I missed my cycle. I had never had that happen before and was telling myself not to worry and hoping my body was just off that month, but then a week went by and I couldn't ignore it. One day after work and before my boyfriend got home, I stopped at the store and bought a pregnancy test. I'll never forget the anxiety I felt standing alone in the bathroom and waiting for the result. When I saw that it was positive, I felt completely stunned. We were absolutely not trying and it was a total accident. As shocking as it was though, I wasn't upset. I was scared but also happy since we had already been talking about marriage and I had always known that I wanted to be a mother someday. At the same time, I was raised believing you had to be married first, and I remember thinking about my parents within the first 10 seconds of seeing the positive test. I was especially worried about telling my mom, and the thought of her reaction had me actually shaking. It terrified me. But still, above all that, I couldn't help feeling a little excited. I did not tell my boyfriend that night, and the only person that knew was a very close friend of mine at work. She could tell I was a mess over the whole thing and recommended taking a second test just to be sure. She also told me to try a different brand, so after work I did that and bought a 2-pack of tests that were another brand. I took one of the tests that evening and did the other one first thing the next morning. Both were positive. There was no doubt I was pregnant. Before work that morning, I finally told my boyfriend. We just sat there feeling everything together. It was a little overwhelming, but also strangely joyful because we were deeply in love. That same day during my lunch break, I made an appointment for my first prenatal visit at the doctor, and they scheduled me several weeks out. Based on my own math, I was most likely 4 to 5 weeks pregnant, so by the appointment I'd be roughly 8 or 9 weeks along. We had also decided not to tell any of our family until after my appointment, just to be on the safe side. We knew his parents would be ecstatic. It was mine we were worried about. A few weeks after this, I had been at my friend's house up in Bennington, about 20 minutes away. Whenever I'd go up there, I would take a back road to and from her house because I didn't like driving on the highway, especially at night. It was around 9 o'clock when I left her house and was making my way home on this road when I noticed something very bright coming up behind me. I thought it was a big truck with bright headlights, and since the road is completely straight, I slowed down and moved slightly to the right so they could pass me, but they never did. These lights got right behind me and were unbelievably bright. So much so they were reflecting in all of my mirrors and right into my eyes so I could barely see the road. I went from going about 55 miles an hour down to maybe 25 and moved as far right as I could without going into the gravel. Then I watched something come directly over my car. In just a second or two, it was in front of me, and I don't even know how to tell you what this looked like. I could really only see the underside of it, but it was jet black and there were all kinds of angles on the bottom. I could see that the bright lights were on the front of it, but every other part had sharp, hard edges. These days, I would say it looked a lot like a giant black Cybertruck in the air, but with more angles. Nothing on it was smooth or rounded. I pulled over and stopped, but it kept going forward at about the same 20 to 25 miles an hour, and it stayed right above the road. It seemed extremely low too, maybe only 50 or 75 feet off the ground, and it was flying like a helicopter, not like a plane. The multiple lights it had on the front were shining straight down onto the road, and I remember hearing and feeling a deep hum, but it wasn't like an engine. Anyone else who might have seen this that night would know it wasn't normal. When it got about half a mile ahead of me, all of its lights went out at the same time, and to my eyes, it disappeared completely. It's dark on that road, and there was no way I could have seen it from that distance without the lights on. I sat there in a mild state of shock, wondering what I had just seen. Then eventually I slowly started driving again, and I made it home without seeing anything else, so it must have flown away from the road. I told my boyfriend about it the second I walked in the door, but I could barely explain it accurately. He was just as confused as I was and had no idea what it could have been. His best guess was that I might have seen a stealth military helicopter, but I can't imagine any helicopter being that quiet. He stayed up later with me that night since it had gotten my adrenaline going, and by the time we went to bed, it was past midnight. When I was finally able to fall asleep, I had an extremely graphic and disturbing nightmare. I dreamt I was lying on my back on a table in a horribly sterile room and giving birth. The whole place reminded me of a commercial kitchen. I could hear and see glimpses of other people around me that I knew were not doctors, but I never got a good look at anyone. I also knew that our baby was coming, and I remember being so scared about that. I kept asking what was happening and if the baby was okay, but no one said a word to me. I was also aware that something was horribly wrong because it was way too soon and the baby shouldn't have been coming yet. I woke up from this nightmare actually hyperventilating and physically trembling. It was the single worst dream I can ever remember having. My boyfriend was next to me when I woke up, and it had woken him up too. All I could do was lay with him because it had been such a scary and emotional dream. I told my friend at work about it because she sat right next to me, and she assured me that wild and vivid dreams were totally normal and common during pregnancy, then let me know it probably wouldn't be my last one. She had a 2-year-old and knew way more than I did about it, so hearing that did make me feel better. I really just wrote it off as my first pregnancy dream. A few weeks after that, things had gone back to normal and I was at my doctor's appointment. I had told her about the 3 at-home tests, but they still had me do another urine test while I was there. When the doctor came back into the room, she sat down and dropped an absolute bomb on me. She told me I wasn't pregnant. Hearing those words come out of her mouth was even more shocking than finding out I was pregnant in the first place. She said that I had most likely had a miscarriage, but I couldn't believe that, and I still don't. I won't get into the details, but I didn't have a single symptom of having a miscarriage. It was absolutely nothing. After that appointment, I felt a slurry of emotions from sadness and confusion, all the way to anger and even a little relief because of my parents, but mostly it felt like a loss. I remember sitting in my car and saying out loud that it was in God's hands. The months that followed this were slow and heavy for me, and I think I went through a period of depression. It hit me a lot harder than I thought it would have for the short amount of time I'd been pregnant. About a year after all of this happened, most of it had faded and my boyfriend and I were engaged and planning our wedding for later that summer. I think I had grown into a stronger, more mature person and everything had felt good again. Then, completely out of nowhere, I had another wild pregnancy-level dream. In this dream, I was way out on that same back road where I had seen that thing fly over my car the year before. I wasn't in my car though. I was standing in someone's field just a few feet away from the road, and I was holding a baby girl. She had blonde hair and adorable fat cheeks and looked to be about 6 months old. I remember exactly what she was wearing too. It was a spring dress that had little wagon wheels on it, and her feet had tiny white socks on them. She was staring at me and smiling, and I was holding her so close. I swear I could even smell her, even though I've never smelled anything in a dream. I felt a tidal wave of love and connection to her that I can't even put into words. Then I remember looking up and past her at the main road and saw 2 figures walking toward me with their arms out. In that moment, and without being told, I knew I had to give her away. I begged them to let me keep her, but it was like I had no control over the situation and I handed her off. Then I watched them walk away. I have no memory about who the 2 figures were, but I woke up with tears running down one side of my face and onto my pillow. This dream was so powerful and moving that I will remember every second of it until the day I die. Today I am married and have 2 children, both boys. Everything that happened back then feels like a lifetime ago, but I can also remember it like it was yesterday. I've had years to question whether those dreams were my subconscious dealing with a surprise pregnancy and the loss of that pregnancy, or if they were more than that. I cannot understand why the first nightmare happened only hours after my experience on that road while driving home. I rarely talk about this, but I am convinced something happened to our first child, which I believe was a girl, and it has to be connected with what I saw and experienced on the road. I also have a gut feeling that for some reason, I was allowed to see my little girl a year later, and that tears my heart right out of my chest. I don't know why any of this happened to me, and I'm staying anonymous here, but I really needed to say it out loud finally. I also wanted to share this story with people who might understand, or at least be open to the possibility that the way I feel might be right. My sighting happened in December of 2000 in Arizona. I will always remember the timing of it because the news was dominated by the contested presidential election between George Bush and Al Gore, and the whole country was on edge. That was actually one of the reasons I got out of town for a few days, because I used to get too wrapped up in politics and needed some nature therapy. When this happened, I was by myself and hiking the Bell Trail south of Sedona. It was my first time on that trail, and I did it on a weekday, so I don't think I ran into more than 10 people. The weather had been perfect too, with clear skies and temperatures in the upper 50s. I was walking at a fairly relaxed pace since it's not a very difficult hike, and had stopped at a big rock off trail that had a pretty incredible view. The reason I stopped was to sit in the sun for a little bit and focus on being in the present. I do this a lot when I hike as kind of a reset, and I love listening to what's around me. I sat on the rock for about half an hour before noticing something in the sky that very quickly got my attention. It had been a bright sunny day, and I really didn't interpret what I was seeing as an object at first since it looked like part of the sky. I thought it was a thin cloud coming in because the color of it matched the sky so closely that it was difficult to separate the two visually. It only took watching it for a couple of minutes and I could tell it was slowly moving, coming in from the east and following the trail west toward me. Since I could see it moving, I was pretty sure it wasn't an optical illusion and something had to physically be there. I was still thinking a cloud though. I watched it get closer and gradually I could see more of a defined shape as well as what looked like a few other colors inside of it. The most accurate comparison I've been able to come up with is that it resembled a large polished chunk of opal moving through the air. Overall, it was mostly light blue, which made it really blend in with the sky, but in the center of it were small pockets of yellow and orange and a hint of green. The colors inside weren't static either. They were subtly changing and reflecting differently in the sun. I stood up on the rock and grabbed my backpack for some reason. I don't really know why I did that. I think I was feeling like I might need to jump back on the trail, but this thing had my undivided attention, and based on the way it was moving, I thought it was going to pass directly over me if I stayed there long enough. I started to wonder if it was the top part of a hot air balloon that had separated from the basket, or possibly a big piece of plastic that had blown away from somewhere because of how smoothly it was moving through the air. It had that same look of floating with the wind. It also wasn't making any noise or changing direction, so I figured it had to be something very lightweight. I remember looking around for other people on the trail, but at that moment I was the only one there. As it continued to move toward me, I was trying to gauge how high up the thing was. My best guess, which could be way off, was somewhere in the range of 500 to 800 feet off the ground. I've stood at the base of Bell Rock in Sedona many times, and I believe that's around 500 feet tall. This object looked to be similar to that height, or maybe slightly higher. It got to a point where I knew it was going to pass over me, and I could easily see it had an actual surface. I could also confirm that the internal colors I'd seen before were definitely there and inside of it. What didn't make sense is that they were pulsing rhythmically like a metronome. There were no lines or seams on it like a hot air balloon would have, and no real structure to it. It really did look like a giant piece of opal the size of a house just floating through the air, and it was kind of taking my breath away. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it didn't look like anything else I've ever seen. I couldn't help but focus on these bizarre colors inside of it because they were pulsing in a steady pattern of twos where they would quickly get more vibrant twice in a row, then there'd be a small pause and they would pulse 2 more times. For some reason, I assumed the pulsing had something to do with how it was staying in the air. I was a little stunned though, and I can't say I was thinking that clearly. As this thing made its way directly over me, I had a powerful and immediate realization that it was not man-made. This was not a conclusion I had reasoned my way into. It was purely on instinct because of how unfamiliar and non-mechanical it was. I want to say it looked organic in a way. It was the dictionary definition of a UFO or UAP because I could not for the life of me identify what it was. At that moment when it was straight overhead, my adrenaline kicked in and I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat. It came in a wave and I could feel and almost hear my heart pumping in my chest and my ears. It was in that split second that I noticed something so unbelievable it's hard to even talk about sometimes because it makes me emotional. The rhythm of the pulsing colors inside of this object very noticeably changed and synchronized with my heartbeat. They were still going in patterns of 2, but they got much faster and perfectly matched the beats I was feeling in my chest. Every single time I felt my heart pump blood, it corresponded directly with the visual pulses inside of the object. When I became aware of this, my heart started beating even faster due to the sheer absurdity of the situation. It was the most incredible feeling I've ever experienced, and I felt physically connected to it, while at the same time having no clue what was happening. It didn't take long for the object to pass over me, so I'm sure only seconds went by. But when it got to the other side of me, it seemed to move upward and away, taking a slightly different path than it had been on. During this time, I felt a strong sense that it was aware of my presence, and as weird as this sounds, I felt like whatever it was aligned with me very briefly on a deep biological level before continuing on its path. It continued floating down the canyon and stayed visible for a while longer, but since it had changed direction, it got almost impossible for me to keep tracking with the angle of the midday sun in the sky. I would guess that at a mile or so away from me, I lost it. I was speechless as I watched it float away and lost all connection with time passing or where I was. I could not believe what had just happened. I think it's so incredible that what I saw never seemed to have any kind of acceleration or deceleration. It looked to me like it was effortlessly drifting the entire time. There were no flashing lights, and I never heard the hint of a sound come from it. When it was all over, I stood there in the desert, totally alone. I attempted to continue my hike afterward, but I couldn't focus on anything, so I ended up turning around and going back to my car. The experience had completely overridden any other interest, and the only thing I wanted to do was drive home, and that's what I did. When I got there that afternoon, I sat my wife down and described every detail to her, repeating myself at least a few times in a row. I lost sleep for days afterward too because it affected me so much. I wrote everything I could remember on paper because I did not want the details to fade or change over time, and I also attempted to sketch the object, but it was an impossible thing to draw. If you want a visual, just look up polished opal because that's very close to what it looked like. I don't think a single day has gone by where I haven't thought about this, and I'm still as clueless now as I was the day it happened. I couldn't even guess where it came from or what its purpose was. I believe I witnessed it completely by chance, and I most likely had no part in what it was doing. However, the synchronization between its internal colors pulsing and my heartbeat is still the most significant aspect of the whole experience. It matched so perfectly that it rules out any kind of coincidence, in my opinion. It responded instantly to the changes in my heart rate, especially when it increased, and it left me with this feeling of connection that I've never forgotten. That brief synchronization makes me think that two separate life forms, very different from one another, were momentarily connected that day. Not through communication or language, but through biology and rhythm. And even though it only lasted seconds, it left a lifelong impression on me. My girlfriend and I were staying at a cabin in Hocking Hills, Ohio in August of 2024. It was a 2-night trip for her birthday, and we didn't have any real plans other than finding a couple of hikes and visiting a local dark sky park that was 20 minutes from where we were staying. This had been sort of a last-minute thing, so we were mostly winging it. On the night we went to the astronomy park, we spent an hour or two looking at the stars, then left to go back to our cabin. There were almost no other cars around, and once we left the park, it felt like we were alone. That whole area is beautiful during the day, but at night it's a completely different place. The roads are narrow with sharp curves, and you never really know what's over the next hill or around the next corner. While we were driving toward town, I was taking it pretty slow, and my girlfriend had been trying to figure out which trail she wanted to go to in the morning. We came up over a small hill, and my headlights hit something in the road that was probably 200 or 300 feet in front of us. My immediate reaction was to hit the brakes because I thought it was a person, and they were standing in the middle of the road right in front of this old abandoned church. I slowed way down as we got closer, and it genuinely looked like a small woman crouched down and hunched over like she was picking something up off the ground. My heart jumped because this was a crazy thing to see out there late at night, and it scared the hell out of me. The second my car came to a stop, she stood up and looked directly at us, and I still have that image burned into my memory. In this split second of time, she was in plain sight, and it looked like her body was wrapped in a white skin-tight bodysuit, including her head and face. We couldn't see any facial features, and there was no hair or skin showing. It was just white from head to toe. Within probably 2 seconds of stopping the car, she turned toward the church and ran, and it was at a full sprinting speed. We watched her run up toward the doors and then go around the back side of it, and she was gone. Both of us were totally freaked out and trying to understand why someone would be out there in the middle of the road at night and dressed like that. Then something clicked in the rational part of my brain, and I thought it had to be a prank. I told my girlfriend and she agreed because it felt like a prank, and right away I wondered if we were being filmed. I pictured someone setting the whole thing up and scaring people as they drove by. That thought took the shock and fear away, but it also made me wonder if we were going to end up online somewhere. I slowly started driving again and pulled up right in front of the church. I didn't want to stop completely because I thought someone might still run out and try to scare us, but we were barely creeping by. The church had been on my girlfriend's side of the car and she rolled her window down, I think just to see if we could hear anybody talking or laughing. It was totally dark and silent outside other than the sound of the car. Then something happened that couldn't possibly be a prank. Instantly and at the same exact time, 2 massive lights lit up the church. These were not headlights or floodlights or anything close to that. They were huge, like giant old-school spotlights or something you'd see lighting up a monument. There was one on each side of the church and they were shining down from above and at an angle, lighting up the entire building and the ground around it. We had no idea what we were looking at and it was blindingly bright compared to how dark it had been just seconds before. The next 2 things happened simultaneously. I hit the gas pedal to leave purely out of reflex. Then, because my girlfriend's window was still wide open, we heard the most god-awful alien sound I have ever heard. It was like a deep pulsing horn sound and there is literally nothing I can compare it to. It was so powerful and low that it made my mirrors vibrate. At that point, I wasn't even thinking, I just drove. I didn't care what direction we were going or what road we were on. It was a pure terror response. My girlfriend was turned almost all the way around in her seat and looking out the back window while telling me to drive faster. As we drove away, I could still see the brightness in my rearview mirror. Then before we could even get around the first corner, my girlfriend said the lights went off, and just like that, it was pitch dark again. Because I had been so focused on the road, the only thing I remember was her frantically yelling, "What was that, Kevin? And I want to go home." She could barely sit in her seat and was so scared, and I don't blame her. I didn't have a clue what had happened. I just kept driving, and faster than anyone should be going on that road. The drive back to the cabin felt like it was never going to end. It took forever to get there, and when we finally did, we couldn't stop talking about it. Whatever it was that we saw completely took over the rest of our trip. My girlfriend was visibly shaken by it, and I felt the same way. She was then and still is now completely convinced that we saw an alien being in front of the church, and she thinks the lights we saw came from whatever brought it here. I hate to say it because I've never really believed in that stuff, but I can't argue with her because it was so unreal. There was nothing out where we were, and there'd be no reason for massive spotlights to suddenly turn on and light up an abandoned church like that in the middle of nowhere, and that's not even taking into account the figure we saw on the road. We really debated going to the police about it, but decided not to since it wasn't technically an emergency, and we don't really know if we were in any actual danger. My girlfriend did call the Hocking County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line though, just to let them know what happened. When I think back about it now, it feels like someone or something was either trying to get us to stop, or we accidentally stumbled into a situation we weren't supposed to see. I am a realist though, and I guess there's still the slightest possibility it was a giant elaborate prank and we were the victims, but that seems too impossible. It would have required unbelievably big lights set up at least 100 feet high on cranes, and a massive sound system to pull off the noise we heard. We never went back up there in the daytime to check, but I can't imagine that'd be the case. I can't emphasize enough how scary this was, and it couldn't have been more unexpected since we had been having such a nice, relaxing getaway. Even when it comes up now, I get chills, and my girlfriend doesn't even talk about it. If we were the guinea pigs in some outrageous, scary prank, I wish I could find out about it, because at least then I'd know it wasn't real. I took a trip to Captiva Island in Florida with my best friend for a wedding in May of 2009. The actual ceremony and reception were at the Captiva Island Resort, but all of us in the wedding party were staying in rental cottages outside the resort and in town. This was a 5-day trip so we could all join a few of the pre-wedding events that were planned, and we also wanted a little time to hang out on the beach and swim. Before the wedding day, there was a dinner cruise on a 2-story boat that was amazing. We also had a guys' golf day with the groom, both dads, and the groomsmen at the resort. Then on the night before the wedding, we joined the family for dinner at a house the groom's family owned. There was a ton of food and drinks, and it went pretty late because everybody was excited and a lot of their family had flown in that didn't get to see each other often. When we finally left the house that night, my friend and I walked back to our cottage to hang out with some of the other guys and have a few more drinks. It was nothing crazy, and at around 1 a.m, everyone called it a night since the wedding was the next day. Maybe an hour later, so this would have been around 2 a.m, my friend and I were still awake. We had eaten some late-night snacks and decided it would be fun to walk down to the beach, which was literally a block away, and do a quick night swim. We grabbed 2 towels and walked to the end of the road. On our way to the beach, we had to walk right past this little restaurant that we'd eaten at after golfing called the Mucky Duck. I will always remember this because of the funny name and how it sat right on the beach. It was also right where we walked out onto the sand to get to the water. The sky was about 50% clear that night, but there were thin partial clouds here and there. We walked maybe 2 or 3 minutes away from the Mucky Duck, set down our towels and flip-flops, and got into the water. We only went about chest deep so we could both stand up, and probably swam around for 3 or 4 minutes. Then my friend came up to me and asked if I felt like I was getting shocked. As soon as he said it, I realized I had also been feeling the exact same thing. It was like a light electrical current through the water. We both stood there trying to verify what we were feeling, and we could lift our hands out of the water, then put them back onto the surface and feel it pretty noticeably. There was definitely a small current running through our bodies. After messing around with it for a minute, it got stronger and started to get slightly painful. I would say it was at the same level as putting a 9-volt battery on your tongue. It was enough to make us get out of the water since we had no idea what was causing it. We walked back up to our stuff and started drying off, still wondering how we could be getting shocked in the ocean like that. This was probably 2:30 in the morning, and there wasn't another soul on the beach in either direction. The next thing I knew, I was seeing a light hitting the entire front side of my body, and that's when I lifted up my head. Coming right out of this thin, flat cloud above us, these massive and stunning shafts of light started coming down all the way to the water. It's hard for me to call them shafts because it was more like one entire curtain of light made up by a bunch of smaller, randomly sized beams. It was very similar to the way the northern lights shimmer and move, except this was pure white and a lot brighter. It's not an exaggeration to say it looked like heaven itself was shining down, and it lit up huge areas on the surface of the ocean. This isn't the easiest thing to describe, but picture this curtain of light starting right near the shoreline, then stretching out over the water for maybe half a mile. It was an incredible thing to see, and the only thing we could hear was the calm ocean. There was no thunder or lightning happening and no rain whatsoever. There wasn't even the moon in the sky. There was nothing that could explain what we were seeing. To say that we were in awe doesn't even come close to how we actually felt. Before we could even put our flip-flops back on, this phenomenon stopped and the whole thing faded out. I would be surprised if it lasted 15 seconds. Basically, it was on, then it was off, but when it was on, it was truly like a northern light show, and I cannot stress enough how big this was. It was probably visible for miles, both on and off the water, and there's no way we were the only ones who saw it. After it disappeared, we stayed on the beach for quite a while waiting to see if it would happen again, but that one time was the only time we saw it. It was also pretty shocking to me that no one else came out to the beach afterward. Captiva is a pretty sleepy place, but I thought someone would have been up. Eventually, we walked back to the cottage but skipped going to bed altogether. We actually stayed up until morning since we would have only gotten a couple of hours of sleep anyway. One of the weirdest things about it was the cloud the lights came out of was barely anything. We could pretty much see the night sky through most of it. We also never saw an origin for where the light could have been coming from. Standing on the shore, it looked like they came right out of the cloud itself and went to the ground. There wasn't anything above it. When the rest of our group was up and around, we told everybody in the wedding party about it. Our story got all kinds of excitement and reactions, but we didn't have a lot of time to talk about it since there was a walkthrough rehearsal that morning. My friend and I also went into a little convenience store next to our cottage before going to the resort, and we told the lady working there what had happened. She was born and raised in Sanibel and said she had never heard of anything like that. The wedding day continued and everything was great, even though I had a hard time concentrating on anything else. A group of us guys did end up going back to the same beach a little past midnight again just in case, but we never saw anything else. Then in the morning, a cab took us to Fort Myers and we flew home. Unfortunately, my friend and I had to leave Florida with this huge unanswered question: what did we see? This experience, whatever it may have been, was the single coolest and most visually stunning thing I've ever seen. Neither one of us has ever claimed it was extraterrestrial, and for all we know, it was a natural occurrence. I am completely sure of one thing though: that curtain of light was on such a grand scale that only nature or something way beyond our capabilities could have created it. In 1989, I was in 5th grade, and about a month before school was out for the summer, we went to a family barbecue at my aunt and uncle's house after church. We did this a lot back then, where we'd go to church on Sunday morning, then a group of people would end up at somebody's house afterward, and usually to eat. That day, my cousins and my grandparents were there along with some family friends and their kids. I remember their yard being full and loud, and it felt like a typical Sunday. The only specific thing that stands out is that I had been on the tire swing in their backyard, and my older cousin Bridget was pushing and spinning me on it. I also know that the food was almost ready, and people had been walking around setting the tables. This next part is a little dreamlike when I think back on it, but while I was in the swing, there was this sudden and blinding flash. It filled everything with light, and my vision went to pure white for a second. The way I have always remembered it, and this is a morbid thought, is that it resembled what it must be like to see the first seconds of an atomic bomb going off right before you're gone. It was just an overwhelming brightness that came from nowhere. It only lasted a second, but it briefly wiped out my sight. Immediately after the flash, my vision started to come back and I was still on the tire swing, but everything around me was moving in this extreme slow motion. I know it doesn't make sense, but I've replayed this in my head for decades and it's exactly how I remember it. I lifted my head up and looked around the yard, and everyone at the barbecue was barely moving, like they were underwater. It looked like an extreme slow motion scene out of a movie, and along with that came this total loss of hearing other than a faint high-pitched ringing in my ears. All the sounds of talking and kids playing were gone. This didn't last very long, but because everything was slowed down, it felt drawn out. In the middle of this slow motion and deafness, I noticed something else, and I remember being very confused by it. There were way too many people in the yard. I could see my mom and dad and my grandparents along with my cousins and other people from the church, so everyone who was actually there was still there, but right next to almost every single person was another figure. I couldn't actually see who these figures were though. Every one of them looked like a three-dimensional shadow with barely distinguishable features, and everybody in the yard had one standing right next to them. It looked like the number of people at the barbecue had doubled. Half of them were my family and the people we knew, and the other half were these shadow figures. Even at 11 years old, I knew something was wrong. Then, as fast as it had started, everything sped back up and snapped into place. The ringing in my ears also faded and my hearing came back. The whole place was loud again and people were moving normally. I have no memory of what happened to the shadow figures though. I immediately jumped off the tire swing because I thought it had something to do with spinning too much, and maybe I had gotten so dizzy that I passed out or had come close but didn't go all the way out. I specifically remember thinking my brain had sloshed around and caused that weird experience, so that was the end of my time on the swing. After that, the barbecue continued like nothing had happened, and that really confirmed to me that what I experienced was in my head. At one point, I did ask my dad about a huge flash, but he didn't see anything, and that was really the end of it. When I was back at school after the weekend, I told this exact story to a group of my friends, and the only reason I did it was because I thought it sounded cool. None of it scared me, I just wanted to make them think something crazy happened to me. A couple of my friends even went around saying Kevin time traveled and spread an exaggerated version of the story. It was just one of those stupid kid things that should have disappeared forever, and it probably would have, but then in the last week of school it came back to me during the weirdest interaction I've ever had with a teacher. On one of the last days of 5th grade, our class got to watch a short movie at the end of the day. This was on one of those old reel-to-reel film projectors where they would wheel the card in, pull the white screen down, and shut off the lights. As soon as it had started, my teacher, Miss Reed, came up to my desk and discreetly said she needed to talk to me in the hall. I thought I was in trouble for something, even though I was always a good kid and couldn't think of anything I'd done wrong. When we got out there, she had 2 chairs already set up and they were facing each other. That detail has always stuck with me because it looked planned. The very first thing out of her mouth was that I wasn't in trouble, which was a huge relief. Then she started asking questions, and she wasn't talking to me like a teacher. She was acting like a family member or a friend, and it was very weird for me to hear her like this. Then she came out and bluntly asked if it was true that I had seen a big flash a few weeks earlier. It took me a second to even realize she was talking about the day of my family barbecue, and I told her I did see something. I sat there and answered more questions and ended up telling her about everything slowing down and seeing extra people in the yard that looked like shadows. At the end of our conversation, she finally admitted that she had also seen the same exact things. She was very calm about it and said she was only trying to figure out what it was or what happened. After that, I was sent back into class to finish the movie. School was over a few days later, then I went on to junior high the next year and I never saw Miss Reed again. When I was in my mid-20s, I ran into a guy named Kyle at the grocery store who I'd gone to school with from kindergarten all the way through graduation. We were never that close, but since I hadn't seen him in years, we stopped in the aisle and caught up for a minute. Somewhere in our conversation, he asked if I had heard about Miss Reed, who I hadn't even thought about since we were in her class. She lived just a few doors down from Kyle's parents' house, so they had known each other for years, and apparently she had passed away about a month earlier. I was really sad to hear about it, but she was in her 80s, so it wasn't totally shocking. Thinking about Miss Reed again did remind me of when she pulled me into the hall, though. That memory really started to bug me after running into Kyle because I couldn't understand how she knew about what happened. She was never at my aunt and uncle's house and had nothing to do with our family. I could only guess that she had heard my friends retelling the time-traveling story in class. The other part I remembered was her telling me she had seen the same things I had. This was a very creepy detail to think about since no one else at the barbecue had reacted to or even acknowledged what I saw. It was only me. It would have been impossible for Miss Reed to have had the same experience unless something did actually happen that day. And then there was the part about her trying to figure out what it was. She had to know something, or at least suspect what we both experienced was real. The more time I've spent thinking about this as an adult, the more I feel like it wasn't in my head. I don't know what could have caused me to see a huge flash of light like that right before entering some kind of slow-motion dream state. Even now, I'm still able to picture everyone standing in the backyard with those shadow figures next to them, and it's scary to say this, but they seem very alien to me. I've had one other thing come up, and this is much more recent, probably within the last 5 years. Sometimes I will sit quietly with my eyes closed and really try to remember this event, and when I put myself back on that tire swing, I now have a very strong sense that there was a shadow figure right next to me too. I live in Wilmington, North Carolina with my husband and our teenage son who is in high school now. In 2011, when he was about 2.5 years old, I had the most terrifying experience while he was in his room and still in a crib. During this time, and for no apparent reason, he started talking about lights at his bedroom window. He would tell us in his little voice that he could see them right outside, and he was convinced the lights would open the window and something would climb into his room, but he didn't know what it was, or at least he couldn't articulate it at that age. The first time he brought it up, my husband and I really didn't pay much attention to it since he was at that age where he was saying all kinds of off-the-wall stuff, but he kept bringing it up, and it was enough that I personally noticed since I spent the most time with him. Some mornings I would even ask if he had seen them again, and sometimes he would say yes, but other times he would say no, so it wasn't every night. In our bedroom on my side of the bed, we had an older baby monitor that was shaped like a miniature TV. It worked fine in the daytime, but the night vision on it could have been better, and it had that grainy, almost green tint to the picture. Once in a while though, we would catch him standing up at the far end of his crib, and he'd be right at the window and talking like he was having a conversation with someone. He was never crying or distressed. He would just stand there and chatter for a while, then eventually lay back down and go to sleep. It didn't seem like anything was wrong really, so we assumed it was his imagination or possibly reflections from outside that he was seeing. Basically, we just let him do it. My husband is a contractor, and there was a 3-day period where he was gone on a job at a beach house that his company was remodeling. I've never slept well when he's not at home, and that first night I had been trying to fall asleep. I tossed around in bed for over an hour, then finally turned on the TV and the local 11 o'clock news happened to be on. At some point during the news, I must have dozed off because I remember jerking awake while sitting up against my pillows. The TV was still on, and I remember seeing Jay Leno's show, so it must have been around 11:30 or 12. Then I realized what had woken me up was hearing my son talking through the baby monitor. I looked over at the screen and saw him standing in his crib again, so I rolled onto my side and was just watching him. At first, he was at the far end near the window where he would always stand, and I had thought about bringing him in to sleep in my room. Then I watched him move from the window side to the darker side of his crib, which faced the open part of his room. He was holding on to the rail and talking non-stop. I couldn't understand most of what he was saying, but he sounded excited, like he was having a real conversation with someone. Then he let go of the crib rail and put both of his arms up in the air. It was the exact same motion he would do when he wanted us to pick him up, arms out and hands open like he was asking to be lifted up. I remember moving a little closer to the monitor because I didn't know why he would be doing that. Then I saw 2 very thin and dark arms come into the frame from the open part of his room, and it looked exactly like something was reaching back toward him to pick him up. I can still see this horrific image in my mind, and it was terrifying because it did not look human to me. It looked like something horrible was trying to grab my son. I screamed at the top of my lungs, and I jumped out of bed so violently that I fell on the floor. I ran down the hall to his room and pushed the door all the way open, and there was no one there. It was just my son standing in his crib alone and staring at me with this look on his face like I'd startled him. His room was completely empty. I immediately picked him up and brought him into my bedroom. Then I shut the door and was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone when I called my husband. It took me 2 times to wake him up, but he finally answered, and I told him exactly what had happened and what I'd seen on the monitor. Like the good husband and father he is, he kept asking if there was actually someone in the house and telling me he would call the police and our next-door neighbors if there was. I was trying to explain that there was no one actually in the room when I got in there, even though I was sure I had seen arms reaching down to his crib. He stayed on the phone with me while I did a walkthrough of the house, checking doors and windows, and everything was shut and locked. Then he tried to calm me down by downplaying the picture quality on the monitor and how it was most likely a shadow from our son's nightlight. I do appreciate what he was doing, but it was not a shadow, and it was absolutely moving like someone was leaning forward to pick him up. He even had his arms out like he was asking to be held, and it was identical to the way he would reach for my husband and say, "Daddy, up." After triple checking the house, I took him into our room and he slept both nights with me. I did a second thorough check in the daytime, and there were no signs of anything around the house or in his room. His bedroom window had also been locked the entire time. Call me a crazy mom, but I had him sleep with us for another week after this happened. It took me a while to feel comfortable putting him back into his room, even though I had no idea what I had seen. His phase of talking about this and standing up in the crib continued for about another month, then it abruptly stopped. One week he just quit bringing it up and he wasn't standing in his crib anymore. It really ended as quickly as it had started. Being a teenager now, he doesn't remember any of this, but I do, and I can still see the image of him lifting his arms up. I clearly remember thinking, why is he doing that? Then I completely lost my mind when I saw the two arms come in from the side. It still bothers me deep into my soul because I saw something in there with him and I know it happened. The other part that still scares me is that for weeks he had been saying lights were at his window and something was coming into his room. Then I actually see what looks like the arms of some creature reaching out to him. My husband thinks this was just my subconscious since our son had been talking about it so much, and that I probably had a very short nightmare while lying there and looking at the monitor, but I have never been able to believe that. Nothing ever happened after that one time, and our son is still in the same bedroom. He has never experienced anything in there that he can remember, and he's completely fine. He even knows the story because I've told him, but he doesn't even think about it. I've had people tell me that this could have been a ghost or even a demon in his room. I'm not religious, so I've never even thought about it that way. I also don't think that makes sense if you look at the whole thing. He had been seeing lights at his window, then he was having interactions and even conversations with something that he said used to come into his room, and in my mind that sounds a lot more alien to me than it does supernatural. I am a lifelong skier, climber, and mountain biker, and I'm always doing one of them depending on the season. Back in 2005, I virtually lived in my 1985 Econoline van that I'd spent years slowly converting into a makeshift camper, and unfortunately I never had any YouTube videos to help, so it was mostly 2x4s and plywood, but I had put a lot of time into it and it worked great for me. I had it mostly insulated with a platform for the bed and a few small cabinets underneath that. Then I added a small cabinet and counter with a camp stove setup. I had even cut shapes out of those windshield sun blockers for homemade window covers with Velcro that fit perfectly so I could mostly black it out at night. There were about 5 years of my life where I only went back home when I needed to make more money. It was a true dirtbag existence, but it was the best time of my life because of the freedom. In January of that year, I had been up in Whistler skiing with a group of friends. After a few weeks there, I headed down to meet another buddy of mine in the Hoh Rainforest in Olympic National Park. I didn't have any set plan as far as reservations. I was just going to meet him in the main campground and figure it out. The day I drove down, I remember it had just started getting dark when I got to Highway 101 in Washington, so it was probably around 4:30 or 5 p.m. and I still had a couple hours left to drive. I went through the little town of Forks around 7 p.m. and it had gotten incredibly foggy. I only stopped to get gas, then left town going toward the Hoh Rainforest campground, which was about an hour away. As soon as I left Forks, it was pitch dark and the fog was heavy, like where you have to drive half the speed limit. I couldn't have been more than 10 minutes out of town when these huge bright headlights rolled up behind me. I was already going slow, but they came up so fast it was like they materialized out of nowhere. 1 second I was by myself on the road, and the next my van was filled with high beam level headlights. Whoever it was obviously wanted to get around me because they aggressively got right up on my ass and stayed there. I also remember the lights weren't normal white headlights. They were an amber or orange, like the color of big fog lights, and at the time I thought that's what they were. Bright fog lights on the front of some redneck's lifted truck. After enduring this for a few minutes, I was getting irritated, especially with the glare in my mirrors because it made it even harder for me to see the road in the fog, so I started looking for a place to pull over. Then, almost instantly, the lights shut off. Most of my attention had been on the road, but I never saw them turn off onto a side road or pull over. It was like they actually turned their headlights off. I remember staring into the mirror trying to figure out where they went, but I could only assume they had quickly turned off somewhere and I hadn't seen it. I was just happy they were gone. Maybe only 5 minutes more down the road, I started feeling like I'd had enough of driving in those conditions. The combination of nighttime and fog and also having someone tailgate me like that had stressed me out. I had already been on the road for 7 or 8 hours that day anyway, and I decided to stop somewhere and finish the last part in the morning. I really just wanted to pull over and sleep for a few hours so I wasn't pulling into the campground in a bad mood. I ended up stopping at this random dirt road on the left side of 101 that went back maybe 50 feet. There was a closed gate on the road, so I turned the van around to face the highway, then backed up and parked with my back doors almost touching the gate. I locked the doors, put all my window covers on, and passed out pretty quickly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but there was no light coming in through the cracks of my window covers, so I knew it was still dark. The reason I had even opened my eyes was because I heard something hit the side of the van and almost incorporated it into my dream. It sounded like a branch hitting against the metal. I was lying there only half awake, staring into the darkness and listening. Then I heard it again, but this time it was unmistakable. It was 3 or 4 solid knocks on the side door, and it was not a branch. This was intentional loud knocking from someone's hand. I was instantly wide awake and I yelled, "Who's out there?" Then the reply I got was the most unexpected thing I could ever imagine. It was 2 higher-pitched voices like kids right outside my side door. They were both saying, "Sir, we need your help," 2 or 3 times in a row. It made no sense since I was miles away from anything, not to mention it was in the middle of the night in thick fog and in January. I sat up, but I didn't turn on any lights. I wanted to keep the inside totally dark so I could see out. I remember peeling back just one small corner of my window cover to look out, and standing right next to my van were 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and they looked to be maybe 10 or 11 years old, and neither of them had coats. I scooted back from the window with a huge rush of adrenaline and grabbed my shoes. Then they knocked again and said the exact same thing, "Sir, we need your help." It hit me right away that there was no change in their tone or panic in their voices, and that's when I got this horrible feeling. I can't explain it, but every instinct in my body said something wasn't right. It felt staged, like bait. My mind immediately went to the scenario where some sketchy backwoods dudes were hiding in the trees waiting for me to open the door so they could rob me or do who knows what. I shouted back that I couldn't help them and that they needed to leave. I slipped my shoes on, grabbed the keys and an old buck knife I used to keep next to the bed, then slowly lifted the corner of the window cover again, only to see nothing. The 2 kids were gone and I didn't hear any footsteps running away, and I never saw any movement through the brush or in the trees. There was nothing outside. I checked out the back windows and the other side windows toward the road, trying to cover every angle, but there was no one anywhere. Somehow that was even scarier than when they were standing there. The whole thing put me into fight or flight, and I had this overwhelming feeling something was going on and I was the target. I climbed over my stuff and into the driver's seat without even thinking. Then I started the van and drove away. I felt so lucky that I'd backed in and was facing the road. Right after getting back onto the highway, I was intensely watching my mirrors and saw something I still can't explain. From the dirt road where I had just been parked, I saw a huge bright orange light cutting through the fog. It couldn't have been headlights because no other vehicle was back there. I had been up against the gate with nothing around me, but this light was shining perpendicular to the highway, so it had to be coming from where I was parked. And the craziest part was they were the same orange color as the bright headlights that had been tailgating me earlier. My mind shifted from thinking I'd almost been robbed to something wildly different. I didn't drive toward the Hoh Rainforest either. I went back to Forks because I wanted to get to an actual town. When I got there, I ended up parking on a side road next to the Forks Motel, which sits right on the main drag. I also remember finally checking the time too, and it was just past 2:30 in the morning, so I still had hours until daylight. Luckily, nobody bothered me while I was there, and I tried to lay in my bed for a while, but I mostly sat there stressed out. In the morning, there was still a little bit of fog, but it was light, and I was ready to get to the campground. I got breakfast before I left, mostly to be around people for a minute, and eventually I met up with my buddy at the campground around noon. Of course, I told him everything, and I think it helped a lot getting it off my chest. What bothered me then and still bothers me now is the fact that I just left the scene. I feel torn in 2 opposite directions about that. I really hope there weren't actually 2 kids out there who needed help, but I'm sorry, I was alone and it gave me the worst gut feeling I've ever had. They looked like kids and sounded like kids, but something about them felt wrong. Why would they ever be out there like that and knocking on a parked van? They couldn't have even known I was in there. Then when I connect that with the headlights that seemed to appear and disappear behind me and the huge orange light I saw when I was driving away, nothing about it is normal. I'm not easily spooked, but that got me. I also don't think I was almost robbed. I think I experienced something that I can't fully understand. I swear that whatever was out there was only trying to look like two kids so I would open the door, and I truly believe that if I had done that, I might not be here telling the story. For years, I have told people a story about my dad from a time when he was young and thought he had been contacted or abducted by aliens. I remember telling this story to my friends all the way back to elementary school, and I was proud of the fact that he had a real alien story that had actually happened. I knew the details so well that I could recite it any time, which I still can, and I'll start this by giving you the same story. When my dad was growing up, he had some kind of treehouse in his backyard that he would play in all the time. It wasn't high off the ground like most treehouses, and I always guessed it was next to the tree rather than in it because he says the ladder to get inside was short and only had a few rungs. In his description, you could climb the ladder, then pull yourself up through an opening in the floor to get into the upper room. One evening in the summer, he had been in this treehouse with a friend. At some point, his friend had to go home, but my dad stayed in the treehouse by himself until after it got dark. There was also a window in one of the walls, which was just an open cutout, but he says he saw a halo of light out of this window, and it was moving toward him through the trees. This halo was soft and white and seemed as big and as wide as the treehouse itself. He didn't know what it was, and he remembers sticking his head out the window to watch it. It was going slowly and came down from around the height of the treetops to just above the ground in the back part of their next-door neighbor's property. And when it got that low, the ring of light either disappeared or turned off and he couldn't see it anymore. This wasn't at all scary to him, it was incredible, and he wanted to climb down and go to the fence to see what it was. Then he heard this talking and laughing that sounded like other kids playing in the trees and around the bottom of the treehouse. I guess this sound had a little bit of an echo to it too, like reverb. It also wasn't threatening in any way, it just sounded like fun. After hearing this, he went to the opening where the ladder was and held the sides to climb down. Then when he looked down the ladder toward the ground, there was a small alien-looking being standing at the bottom staring right back up at him. The strangest part was that he didn't feel any fear, he only felt like this was a new friend waiting for him to climb down, and that's what he did. When he got to the bottom of the ladder, he was face to face with it and could see it clearly, though I don't remember any specific details about it other than it was about the same size as him and undeniably not human. After that, he only remembers walking with it toward the neighbor's fence. Then he has a few vague snippets of being in a room with more of these beings, and from what I can remember, it sounded similar to a playroom or a preschool meant for kids. There were also larger adult-sized beings walking past this room, but he felt like they were only there to keep an eye on things like parents might do. Then he found himself sitting on the grass under the treehouse again near the bottom of the ladder, and that was the end of it. That's his full story, and I believed every word of it. It wasn't just something cool I would tell my friends either. It was something I really thought about a lot. I wondered what it must have been like to have an encounter like that, and as I got older, I wanted to know what had actually happened to him. The whole thing fascinated me. Then when I hit college, something happened that completely flipped this story upside down. I was at my friend's apartment with 5 other guys. Everyone was drinking, even though we were all about a year underage, and somehow we got onto scary stories. A couple of the guys who were there grew up hunting and talked about creepy screeching and howling sounds they had heard in the woods at night. Another guy had a story about running into some crazy and armed survivalist at a remote fishing spot that could have ended badly, and after him I ended up telling my dad's story. When I finished telling mine, one of the guys there was really interested in what I had said. He was pretty heavily into aliens and UFO research, and he started asking me questions about it. He really wanted to know if my dad had experienced a loss of time during his encounter, and he also wanted specifics about dates and locations. I told him I'd ask my dad about it the next time I talked to him, and that's exactly what happened. Just a few days later, I did talk to my dad, and I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd asked him about his story. It was probably way back when I was only 10 or 11 years old. The first part of our call was just saying hi. Then I asked if we could run through his UFO story again and told him about my friend being so interested in what had happened to him. There was this long, silent pause on the phone. Then he just said, "What are you talking about?" I repeated myself and specifically said the UFO story when you thought you were abducted by alien beings as a kid. It was like he had no idea what I was saying and told me nothing like that had ever happened to him. That turned into him laughing at the fact that I'd even asked a question like that. I really thought he was purposely messing around, and we went back and forth about it while I brought up the treehouse and the halo and the small beings he saw. At one point, he cut me off, saying he never had a treehouse because where he lived at that age barely had a backyard. This phone call almost turned into a real argument because I was so sure he was denying it. I would have bet my life savings this story came from him. Then he asked if I was confusing the treehouse with a play structure he'd built for me in the backyard of our first house, which was a place I only barely remember living in. That single sentence stopped me from taking a breath, and I mean that literally. I couldn't breathe for a second because I instantaneously remembered the play structure he was talking about. It was vague, but I could still picture it. It was a DIY version of one of those wooden play sets you can buy at places like Costco, and it had this little room on top with a window. He had also cut an opening in the floor and added a short wooden ladder so I could climb up into it. As I went over these little details with my dad, it really came back clearly. He said I used to love the thing and played in it all the time until I started school. Then he ended up taking it apart and it went to the dump. It was unbelievable when this all came together. The treehouse structure wasn't from his childhood, it was from mine, and this story I had been telling for 2 decades about my dad's alien abduction was actually something that happened to me. I don't know how to fully explain this twisted level of realization and what it felt like, but it was a total paradigm shift for me. I don't know how it happened, but somewhere along the line when I was young, my mind made it about him for some reason. Once I remembered the play structure, there was no doubt. I was remembering my own memories. I couldn't tell you when I started telling this as my dad's story, but now I wonder if it was some kind of defense mechanism. I genuinely and with everything in me believed it was a true story that he had told me. It blows my mind to think this was my experience all along. What makes it even harder for me to deal with is that I can't remember anything more than what I've always described. No additional memories or insights have ever come to me. It's still the same exact story. The only difference now is that it belongs to me, and I wish more than anything that I could figure out what actually happened. My name is Michelle, and I have a very different story to share. You can be the judge if it was extraterrestrial or not, but in my opinion, I feel like somehow it was. In 2017, I was 26 years old and in my first apartment. One of the things I always made time for after leaving my parents' house was going out to dinner with my dad because we've always been really close and made it a point to get together about once a month. It really didn't matter if it was a nice restaurant or a foot-long from Subway. It was just something we both wanted to do. One night after we'd had dinner at our favorite Mexican restaurant, he was driving me back to my apartment and said something in the car that caught me totally off guard. We were only a few minutes away from where I lived when he asked if he could share something with me that I might find a little unusual. Of course I said yes. Then he made me promise not to think he was going crazy and admitted that lately he had been seeing things above the house at night. I could tell he was serious about it and asked him to elaborate. He told me that over the past few weeks he had been seeing little clusters of lights in the sky. It wasn't happening every night, but he had seen them 5 or 6 times in total, and being a night owl, it was always late and after my mom had gone to bed. He described them as tiny points of light that would move in patterns together, and they were always above the house. He's a very grounded person, and I could tell it was a hard thing for him to talk about. I tried to stay rational and told him that what he was seeing had to have a normal explanation. We only stayed on the subject for a minute, and then he dropped me off. This happened to be on a Sunday night, and since I had to work in the morning, I went to bed shortly after getting home, and the second I fell asleep, I had this incredibly clear and real dream about him. This is how that dream went. I was walking through a huge hilly field with my dad. It was at night, and there were tall grasses everywhere around us. The stars were out in full force, like where you can see part of the Milky Way going across the sky, and we were walking next to each other and talking just like we would in real life. Other than the location, it felt totally normal. Then, straight above us, there were clusters of lights moving around, and we watched them change directions and break apart, then come together again. It looked like it had been choreographed. We both stopped walking to watch, and he told me that these were the lights he was telling me about. I was amazed at how beautiful they were and how strange, but visually it was incredible. Then they started to slowly drop down closer to us, and they got bigger and brighter, like they were falling right into the field. At the same time this was happening, I looked over at my dad, and he told me he had to go. I didn't really understand any part of what was going on, but as soon as he said that to me, one of the lights broke away from the group, came straight down, and hit the ground in front of us. It was so bright I remember covering my eyes with my hands, and when I opened them again, my dad was gone. The dream ended with me standing in the field, totally alone, and I had this deep feeling of emptiness and loss. It actually brought me to tears, and that's what woke me up. When I got up, I looked at the clock and still had about 2 hours left before my alarm would go off, but there was no chance I could get back to sleep after a dream like that, so I got up and put the news on until I left for work. This was one of those dreams that stays with you for the whole day, and that's exactly what happened. It also gave me a nagging feeling to call my dad, so I ended up calling him when I got home that night. Our conversation went like it always did, but then I had to tell him about the dream I'd had. I wasn't even past telling him we were walking in a field together when he stopped me and said he couldn't believe what I was saying. Apparently, that same night, he'd had a very similar dream about me. We weren't in a field in his dream, but we were together and watching the same lights in the sky. As if having the same dream about each other wasn't crazy enough, he had also seen one of the lights fall to the ground in front of us, but his dream ended there, whereas mine kept going a little while longer when I was alone in the field. He told me it made him want to call me, but he didn't want to bother me on a workday. We were both a little dumbfounded that something like this was possible, and it's hard to describe how it made me feel. We didn't know what to think about it, and at the time we decided it must have been from what he had said in the car and the close father-daughter connection we've always had. There really wasn't another explanation that we could come up with, but we did agree it was something special. Not another word was said about it for months afterward. Then my dad picked me up from work one day for lunch, and while we were at the table waiting for our food, he brought it up again, totally out of the blue. He said that he had seen more lights again over their house. It had only been one time, but they were exactly the same as before, and then he made a comment about feeling connected to them mentally and physically, which actually concerned me a little. He made it sound like they were specifically there for him, and it had me slightly worried about his mental well-being because he was very serious. It was definitely unexpected, and we talked about it for a little bit while we ate lunch, but I didn't have the time to dig deeper since I had to get back to work. Looking back though, I wish I would have called out and spent the rest of the day with him because I could tell he wanted to talk, and I just got this feeling he wanted to spend more time with me. This is the difficult part of my story. Not even 2 weeks after we had had lunch, I got a call from my brother at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was so early that I almost knew something was wrong before I answered the phone. I will never forget hearing his shaking voice on the other end telling me our dad had just had a massive heart attack in the middle of the night. There were no warning signs, and even though he avoided doctors outside of an emergency, he was healthy and had no previous issues that anyone was aware of. That was March 7th, 2018, the day my dad passed away. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, but words don't exist that can describe what this did to me. I've never been closer to another human being in my life, and just like that, I didn't have him anymore. After the horrible initial period of shock and grief, I started to deeply think about what had happened leading up to my dad's passing. I was going over it hundreds of times in my head at work and at night and everywhere else. I couldn't stop wondering if the lights he had been seeing were some kind of sign from the afterlife or if they were something totally different. He said they were actual real things in the sky and he had been wide awake every time he saw them, so I have to think it was something in the physical world. I'm just not really sure how I feel about that. The most unbelievable part of it, though, was the dream we'd had together. The entire thing seemed to be centered around those clusters of light, and it makes me emotional every time I think about it because I can't figure out what they were or what it all meant, especially since my dream had ended with him gone and me standing alone in a field. I've had some years to process this, and I feel like something out there was watching my dad and possibly in contact with him in some kind of way, and I believe he knew it. I also think that whatever this was somehow knew it was the end of his time here on Earth, and they gave me a glimpse of that in my dream. I'll say it again, I don't know if this was related to life or entities outside of our planet and our understanding, but I feel like it was. My dad experienced something very strange and he felt connected to it at the end. I also know that it really affected him or he wouldn't have told me about it, and I guess I just wish I knew what it was. My name is Richard and I'm from Jerseyville, Illinois. I'm 73 now, but I had a life-changing experience in July of 1968 when I was 15 years old. We lived on a farm and had a huge cornfield, so by that age I had been helping my dad for years and had a pretty good work ethic. I had also been driving my dad's truck and tractor around our property since I was 12 and was pretty comfortable with driving way before I had my license. That summer, I had been spending time with a girl named Barbara who I couldn't keep my eyes off of. We went to school together and she lived just a few minutes down the road from us. One day, my two best friends and I were in town with Barbara and her two friends. I will always remember this day, even though we didn't do much of anything, because before we all went home that evening, Barbara gave me my first real kiss and it just about knocked me off my feet. As a young boy, I didn't know what to do with myself after it happened, but before we all went home, she said something about how she had always wanted a boy to surprise her by putting flowers on her bedroom windowsill late at night so she could find them in the morning. I didn't know where she got that idea from, but the second she said it, I knew I was going to be the boy that did it. I need to quickly interject here and say that what I did that night was so stupid and out of character for me, and if my dad had caught me, I would have gotten his belt without a doubt. I absolutely knew better, but since I had been head over heels for this girl, it affected my decision-making skills. Before I went to bed, I picked a handful of flowers from my mom's garden, wrapped them up in brown paper with a little note, and tied the whole thing together with twine. I sat in my room and stayed awake until 1 o'clock in the morning, then snuck out of our side door and took my dad's older truck that we parked on the side of our barn. This truck was a 55 GMC that was mostly used for work and didn't leave the property that much. I remember pushing it in neutral as far from the barn as I could before starting it because I did not want to wake anybody up. Once I got it going and out onto the road, I was definitely sweating from fear, but also because of the mission I was on. I had never done anything like it before, and while I had driven that truck plenty, taking it in the middle of the night like that felt like it was on the same level as robbing a bank to me. But I was so focused on Barbara that I probably would have driven up to Canada if she'd asked. When I got to her house, I parked a few hundred feet away from their driveway and ran up to her windowsill. I was scared to death that her dog was going to hear me and start barking. Then one of her parents would get up and catch me, and that was terrifying, especially if it was her dad. I laid the bundle of flowers on the windowsill as quietly as I could, then ran straight back to the truck and started driving home. This road was a dirt road, and on both sides of it were acres and acres of cornfields. I was going slow, but it was still only a 5-minute drive back to my house. It was on that road where something happened that changed my life forever. I had only gotten about a minute away from Barbara's house when the headlights started acting up. They were flickering off and on and getting brighter and dimmer. Then they went out completely, and within seconds the engine stalled and the whole truck just died. This put me into a real state of panic, and I mean this was a live or die situation because the only thing I could think about was my dad. If his truck had actually broken down out there, I would never see the light of day again. I got out and was going to check under the hood even though I didn't know what I'd even be looking for. I just knew I had to do something, but when I shut the door, I felt this wind on me and I heard the lowest sound I think I've ever heard. When I turned around, there was something huge in the air coming right over my head, moving south to north. What I saw was a pitch-dark object, and it couldn't have been more than a couple of 100 feet off the ground. There wasn't a light or a beacon or even a reflection on the thing. It was completely black from front to back. There wasn't a single sound coming out of it either. There was only this wind coming down, and it was strong enough to blow my hair around. I stood in the middle of the road and watched it go all the way over me, then out above the field. I can remember wondering if this was what a flying saucer looked like, but the truth is it didn't look anything like what I had always seen in pictures and movies. It wasn't even close. This object wasn't round. It was much closer to a trapezoid shape or a rough triangle with a flat or rounded point on the front. What shocked me the most, though, was the lack of lights. It really blended in with the dark sky, but at the same time I could see that it was blocking out the stars above it. It looked like a piece of pure darkness moving through the sky, and it was as terrifying as it was unbelievable. I know one thing for sure, I didn't move a muscle as it went over me. I don't know if I thought it couldn't see me if I was still, but I stayed like a statue. When it got over the cornfield, the only thing I wanted to do was get out of there and get back home, so I got in the truck without even remembering it had died and turned the key. Miraculously, the engine turned over immediately. There was no hesitation or struggle to start. It was perfect, like nothing was wrong with it. Then I drove home faster than I'd ever driven anything on 4 wheels. Thank God I still had enough sense left in me to get my speed up on our driveway so I could kill the engine and coast up to the barn. No matter what had just happened, I knew I couldn't make any noise. Long story short, I got away with it and my dad never found out I had taken his truck. I did confess and tell him this entire story later on, but it wasn't until I was much older. For days after this, I couldn't think about anything else, not even Barbara, and that's saying something. I was completely focused and almost obsessed with what I'd seen because it was unlike anything I could have even imagined back then. The only person I talked to was my best friend and neighbor, Billy. My story put him into a level of excitement I had never seen in him before, and he started asking me questions about meeting aliens and which planet I thought they were from. He was thinking about the whole thing like it was a movie, but it wasn't like that at all. It was so much stranger than anything I had seen or heard of at the time, and it was so far from what I thought something like that would look like that I didn't have words for it. I even sketched a picture of it with a pencil and paper just because I wanted to see it again. 3 or 4 days after my sighting, and right about the time I was starting to feel a little more back to normal, I noticed something on the underside of my wrist when I had a long-sleeve shirt on while working with my dad. When I lifted up my sleeve, it looked like I had gotten a splinter because the skin was raised up and it hurt when the fabric rubbed on it. Later that night, I was in the bathroom getting ready for bed and started picking at it because something was stuck under the skin. I got my pocket knife and tweezers, and maybe this sounds crazy now, but the way I grew up, we would just cut splinters out. I poked my knife in on one side where I thought it went in. Then after trying to push it out, I could see the end of something in there. I believed it was a normal splinter I got from outside, so I grabbed the tip of it with the tweezers and pulled it all the way out. Then I saw right away it wasn't wood. It was the tiniest piece of metal. It was the shape and size of a grain of rice if you cut it in half the long way, and surprisingly, it didn't have a sharp end or point on it. It was just a thin sliver of metal, and I can still remember it perfectly. Being 15, I didn't think to question where it had come from or why it was in my arm. I just tossed it in the toilet. After a splash of Bactine, I went on with my night, and for a long time I didn't think about this. It wasn't until I was much older that I started to question the piece of metal in my arm and how it had shown up right after I'd had a close encounter. These days, I do feel like it had something to do with it. I know that's just speculation, and I didn't have any kind of abduction or time that I can't account for, but I've lived long enough to know when something in life doesn't feel right, and that has never felt right to me. For anybody wondering, the answer is yes. Barbara got the flowers on her windowsill. She did love them, but we never ended up becoming a couple. I met my wife after high school, got married in 1976, and we've been together ever since. Even as an old man, I think about how incredible this was. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. I've gone back to that same spot on more than one occasion too, even at night, and I can still picture the black shape going over me. It's really amazing to me that a single 60-second event can change who you are forever. This is something that happened when I was a kid, and for a long time I didn't tell anyone about it. Not because I didn't want to or it didn't matter, I just felt like I couldn't explain it without sounding a little crazy. I still don't exactly like explaining it because it brings back memories, but here's my story. When I was growing up, my parents would go on date nights about once a month, and when they did, they would drop my sister and me off at my grandparents' house. Their place was a little ways outside of town, so it was quieter and darker than where we lived. We would stay the night there, then get picked up in the morning, and my grandparents were always great about doing things with us and overfeeding us. It was a routine that happened for years, and we loved it because we were very close to our grandparents. Then I hit 12 or 13 years old, and something started happening to me only when I stayed at their house. The first time, I didn't even know what it was, and it legitimately scared me more than anything I had ever experienced up to that point. I didn't know it at the time, but it turns out I was having sleep paralysis. The way it went was I would be lying in bed in their spare bedroom where I always stayed, and right on the edge of falling asleep. This was just a plain room with nothing more than a framed world map on the wall, so there wasn't much to look at. Somewhere in the sleep process, I would wake up, or at least I thought I did, and my eyes would be wide open. I could see the room and the doorway, and I could even look over at the map on the wall. I knew exactly where I was and could think as clearly as if I were wide awake, but I couldn't move. My arms and legs felt locked down to the bed, and I couldn't turn my head or even make a sound. I remember trying to yell, but was so far from being able to that I stopped wasting my time. It was incredibly claustrophobic, like being trapped inside my own body with no way out. Then I would see the silhouettes of two figures coming into the room, and when this first started, they were just dark outlines with no detail. I only knew there were two of them walking in through the doorway. They moved normally like anyone else would walk into a room, which somehow made it worse. Then they would walk up to the bed and get extremely close to me, and this was way too close, where they were leaning in and inspecting me. It gave me a deep, angry feeling like they were in my personal space. I never felt anyone actually touch me, but it was violating because I couldn't stop it. Eventually, I would watch them walk away and out of the room. Then I would break through the paralysis and my body could move again. There were a few times where I jumped off the bed and looked around the first floor, but it was always empty other than my sister on the daybed in my grandma's sewing room. Over the next year, it would happen every time we stayed with them, but nowhere else. I never experienced this outside of their house. It also followed the same pattern every time and in order, where I would wake up paralyzed, see the two figures walk over to me, then wake up. Nothing changed other than me starting to expect it, which actually made it scarier. As it continued, these sleep paralysis episodes lasted longer and were more drawn out, which was really hard on me since I was keeping it all a secret. There was one night in particular that stood out though, and until then I had only ever seen dark outlines coming into the room. That time had a lot more detail for some reason, and I could see their faces well enough to know they were not silhouettes of people. When they came close to the bed, what I saw was horribly alien to me, and I mean that in a way where I'd never seen anything like them. Their features resembled a human face, but at the same time had very disturbing and unsettling differences. Like their eyes had these deep lines under them and they were too far apart, and their noses were almost non-existent. Looking at them in detail gave me a physically sick feeling, and it left me with some real PTSD. It was easily the scariest thing I can remember because of how real it felt and how close they were to my face. Right around my 14th birthday, this all stopped. Part of the reason could be because I was staying home alone more at that age and I didn't go to my grandparents' house as much, but I did stay with them occasionally and I never had it happen again. I always felt like my birthday had something to do with it. I kept all of this to myself forever, but it never stopped bothering me. I did find a book from the library about sleep paralysis during high school, and a lot of what I read was very similar to what happened to me. Not being able to wake up and seeing dark figures in the room was such a common theme. I even read a story about a guy who would see a dark figure float into his room and hover over him horizontally just inches away from his face, and that sounded horrific. But my experiences were a little different, and I never really found anyone else who got a close-up detailed view of the figures like I did. I mostly pushed all of this down, kept my mouth closed, and tried not to think about it, but years later, something brought it back in a way that I could never have guessed. I was bowling after work with my dad and my Uncle Jeff and a few of their friends. We had pitchers of beer going around, and I ended up having a long, semi-drunk conversation with my uncle, who I've always been pretty close to. I don't remember how we got on the subject, but he said something about never staying at his parents' house again, which is my grandparents' house. When I asked him why, he jumped into this rant about their house being haunted or having evil spirits in it, and he was being totally serious. Jeff is a cigarette-smoking, beer-drinking, bar-fighting guy. I had never heard anything like that come out of his mouth before, and I had definitely never seen him be afraid of anything. He told me that when he was still living there back when he was a teenager, he would wake up pinned down to his bed and saw black demons come into his room. When I heard him say that, I just about dropped my beer on the floor. It turns out he had been tortured by an eerily similar sleep paralysis for years in that same house, and it was enough to make him move out at 17. In his words, there was something wrong with that place. I ended up telling him everything that happened to me, and we realized that both of us had gone through almost the exact same thing, even though it happened to him a couple of decades before it happened to me. He had never gotten any close-up view or detailed faces like I did, and he was calling them ghosts and demons, but that's not what I saw. To me, they looked like actual aliens or disfigured human beings, and when I told him that, I think I unlocked a whole new fear in his own experience. That night at the bowling alley confirmed to me that it wasn't just something in my head. It also made me dismiss the sleep paralysis theory because it seems impossible that two separate people could have virtually the same paralysis and visions in the same place 20 years apart. Jeff and I believe that whatever happened to us was very real because of how perfectly it lines up, and we think we were possibly being visited or studied by something. We're not sure about the reason it happened to both of us, though. That could be the house itself or the location of it, or maybe even our blood relationship. It's given us a pretty deep connection now that goes far beyond an uncle and a nephew. It's really weird too, because this is never something that we try to joke about or make light of, which would be way more normal for both of us. We always tend to do that. It's much more of a serious shared trauma, and as horrible as it was, I'm actually glad we have each other to lean on. In the summer of 2014, my family rented a cabin on the McKenzie River in Oregon for a 4-day weekend. There was a main 2-bedroom, 2-bath cabin with a kitchen, then a smaller secondary cabin next to it. I stayed in the main cabin with my parents, and my brother Jim was in the smaller one with his wife and their 2 kids. The entire property was gorgeous, and it was right on the water. The weekend started out great because it was hot and we were in the water a lot. My mom was also cooking the meals, and we were mostly spending time together in chairs by the river. The main cabin had the only kitchen, so that's where we all congregated during the day, and it was just a fun family vacation. Nothing happened until the second night we were there, and on that night, I was in the main cabin getting ready for bed around 10 p.m. My parents had already gone into their room, and I was in a smaller bedroom next to the kitchen. While I was in there, I got this really uncomfortable feeling like I was being watched. I don't know how else to explain it other than I just had this strong sense that I wasn't alone. I'm sure most people can relate to that. This feeling wasn't overwhelming or anything, and I mostly ignored it, then got into bed, shut the light off, and laid there listening to the river with the window wide open. The moon was also pretty bright that night, so there was a little bit of light coming into the room. I was facing the window and the river when I first got into bed, but eventually I rolled over so I was facing the other side of the room, and on that side there was a small closet. It had 2 doors that opened outward, and each door had those wooden slats running all the way down so you could kind of see through the cracks. For some reason, I started to intensely focus on this closet. I could see the darkness inside through the slats, and that feeling of not being alone came creeping back in even stronger. It was like I couldn't stop looking at them, and I remember thinking I was just freaking myself out. Then up near the top of the closet, I swear I actually saw something move inside. Seeing it made me sit straight up in bed and scoot way back away from the closet and toward the window. I was trying to stay rational, and the first thing that came into my head was that a mouse or other rodent had gotten into the cabin, especially since people had been coming in and out all day. Thinking back on it, I have no idea why I didn't just get up and tell my dad, but at the time I thought if I just opened the closet door, it would run out into the living room. Then I leaned out from the bed without actually putting my feet on the ground, grabbed the handle on the closet door and swung it all the way open. The second that door opened, I just about had a heart attack because sitting up on the little upper shelf inside was an owl. It was just perched there completely alive and moving its head. I screamed so loudly it probably woke people up in other cabins down the river. I jumped out of bed and ran straight into my parents' room, yelling to my dad that there was an owl stuck in my room. At that point, this whole thing turned into a huge deal. All the lights came on, my parents got up, and my brother even came over because he had heard me scream. Then we huddled in the living room and tried to figure out what to do about it. My dad went into the bedroom first and confirmed it was still in the closet. Then he and my brother opened both outside doors and went in with a broom and a blanket to try and catch it or make it fly out on its own. For about 10 minutes, my mom and I stood in the kitchen waiting for this thing to fly out of the bedroom. It finally did, but immediately went into frantic circles around the living room before finally finding its way out the sliding glass doors. It was honestly one of the most insane situations you can imagine. It reminded me of the bat scene in the movie Black Sheep when Chris Farley and David Spade tried to get a bat out of their cabin. Ours wasn't quite that hilarious, but it felt just as chaotic. After it flew outside, we shut all the doors and were uncontrollably laughing because it was just so ridiculous. My mom actually felt really bad for the owl and kept saying the poor thing had probably been stuck in there for days. It was really something that none of us could ever forget. After that crazy night, everything calmed back down and the rest of the trip was totally normal. We were all joking about it for days, but I noticed a small detail that wasn't really funny to me. When the commotion was over and we had gotten the owl out of the house, it was almost 4 o'clock in the morning. In the moment, I wasn't thinking about that at all, but later on I realized I had found the owl shortly after going to bed, so that would have been around 10:30 at night. I couldn't understand where that many hours had gone unless I had unknowingly fallen asleep, but I'm almost positive that didn't happen. After the vacation was over and I was back at home, it didn't feel like anything more than a fun family trip with a funny story in the middle. But then I had 2 unbelievably vivid dreams, or more accurately, visions about the cabin, and they happened right in a row. The first one was at night and right when I was going to bed. I do not feel like this was a dream, but I'll call it that to make it easy. In this dream, I was back in the bedroom of the cabin and standing at the window looking out at the river. Slightly downstream from us, it looked like there were fireworks going off. I could hear these loud, muffled pops echoing through the woods, and there were wildly colorful lights reflecting on the river. I never actually saw any fireworks in the sky because there were tall trees around the cabin, but these colorful flashes were stunning and they came from somewhere above the river. Each time I saw one, it was followed by a popping sound, and I think that's why I felt like it was fireworks. This dream was very weird, but also peaceful and beautiful at the same time. The very next day, I had another dream about the cabin, but this one happened after I had eaten dinner and was watching Orange is the New Black on my couch. I think this had to be some kind of waking vision because I wasn't even tired. It just happened while I was sitting there with my feet on the coffee table. In this one, I was back in the bed at the cabin, lying on my side and facing the closet, exactly like I had been when we'd actually found the owl. I was staring at the upper slats of the closet door where it was completely black inside, but I had this intense feeling of anxiety and fear. It also felt like I was completely alone out there, like none of my family was at the cabin anymore and it was just me. It was a very helpless and lonely feeling. As I kept staring through these slats, I almost knew something was going to happen. Then I saw the owl's eyes slowly move out of the darkness until they were right up against the slats and staring directly at me. I could even see moonlight reflecting on the eyeballs, and when we made direct eye contact, it pulled back into the closet. This was so deeply terrifying that it violently snapped me back into reality. It was really worse than a nightmare because I knew I hadn't actually been sleeping. It's really hard to explain. After that horrible vision, I couldn't help but start to analyze the whole owl situation, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it all seemed. The cabins we rented were extremely nice and couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 years old at the time. It's not like these were old vintage cabins where animals were getting in. It also had been professionally cleaned before we got there, so I feel like whoever did the cleaning would have checked the bedroom closet. And lastly, the day we got there when I was putting my things in the bedroom, I could swear I opened both closet doors just to look inside, and I don't remember seeing anything in there. I guess it's possible the owl was sitting on that upper shelf and I somehow missed it, but it seems like it would have made a sound or moved or something. It had me really confused and it always felt like I was missing something. Fast forward all the way to 2020, 6 years after that vacation, and I was doing a lot of binge watching from comedy shows to documentaries and whatever else. I think a lot of us were doing the same thing that year. During that time, I somehow came across a movie called The Fourth Kind from 2009, and I learned that owl sightings can sometimes be connected to close encounters, like alien close encounters. I had never heard anything like that before watching the movie, but apparently it's not uncommon. That made me do a little more digging to figure out the species of owl we saw in the cabin, and I found out without a doubt it was a barn owl because of the unmistakable heart-shaped face and black eyes. Barn owls are common in Oregon, but from what I read, they stay in the valley and live in more open field-like areas for hunting reasons. Our cabin was halfway up McKenzie Pass in the Cascade Range, and in no way was it open. It was heavily forested up there. I can't say what happened for sure, but I find it very strange the owl was in our cabin at all. I also wonder why I had 2 visions about being back there, where the first one was about that light show in the sky, and the second one was the owl staring at me through the slats in the closet. And finally, there's the time discrepancy. I experienced about an hour going by when in reality it was 5, and that makes me think other things happened in those 4 hours that I'm not aware of. In August of 1993, I went on a camping trip with my dad and his 2 friends, Dave and Mark. I was 14 years old, and this was right before my freshman year in high school. We lived in Boise, Idaho, and on this trip we went way out to a place called Big Roaring River Lake. I have never been back to the location, but I remember it being very deep into the mountains. I want to say we spent more than an hour on a dirt road to get there. It was also just a weekend trip where we left on a Friday and came home Sunday. My dad's friend brought a canoe and fishing gear for me to use, but I think they mostly went up there to have a guys' weekend and to drink. When we got there, the lake was a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be, but I'm pretty sure it did have an established campground with campsites. I honestly don't remember much about the place now, but basically there were a lot of trees around and we were right on the water. There were other people camping that weekend, but not many. On our first night, we were doing marshmallows around the fire and it was just normal camping. I don't know what time it was exactly, but after the sun had been down for a while, we started seeing a lot of shooting stars. They were just happening here and there earlier in the night, but as it got later, I swear we were seeing one every minute, maybe even more than that. This really stands out in my mind because I had never seen that many in my life. None of us knew it was going to happen either, we just got lucky. I later found out that 1993 was a record-breaking year for the Perseid meteor shower, and that's why we had seen so many, but at the time we had no idea. We all stayed up really late watching them, probably until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, but somewhere in there we saw something crazy. One of the shooting stars or meteorites came streaking across the sky, and you could obviously tell it was lower and brighter than all of the normal ones. Then it actually came over us with a huge green trail and had to have made it all the way down to the ground. This was like a real impact, and every one of us saw it. It looked like it hit somewhere on the hill around the other side of the lake, and the most amazing part about it was that we heard the thing rip through the air. I don't know how common it is to actually hear one of these, but it made a sound. There wasn't an explosion or a boom, so it might not have physically hit the ground, but it was so incredibly close to us, and we were talking about it for a long time. A little while after that happened, the night finally wound down and everybody went to bed. The next day, we didn't really do anything other than taking the canoe out to try and catch trout, and by late afternoon, my dad and his friends were drinking beers and starting to make dinner. They were having a good old time, but I was 14 and bored, so while they were cooking, I decided to wander around the lake for a while because I didn't have anything else to do. I don't know why this popped into my head, but I started thinking about the meteor we saw come down, and I wanted to go look for it over where I thought it could have hit the ground. I actually believed I might find a piece of it and had this idea in my head that it would be worth money, so I started walking in that general direction. I went about halfway around the lake, then started going up a hill on the other side and away from the water. I could always see the lake below me, so I wasn't worried about getting lost, and this was back in the days when it was normal to let your kids explore in the woods. I'm sure my dad didn't even think twice about me going over there. On my way up the hill, I wasn't on any kind of trail. I was just cutting through the trees with a walking stick I found and looking around on the ground to kill time. Then I heard something make a noise ahead of me like a decently sized animal. It was definitely loud enough to startle me and bring my head up, and as soon as I looked forward, I saw something standing in the woods about 100 feet away from me. For a split second, I thought there was a child standing on the top of a tree stump, but everything happened so fast it took a second for my brain to catch up with what I was actually seeing. When it did, I realized it was not a child, and I didn't know what I was looking at. It had a human shape that was probably 4.5 feet tall, maybe 5 at the most, and it actually was on top of this big wide tree stump that was sticking up a few feet off the ground. It had no clothing or hair covering any part of its body. All I saw was dull gray skin. The other thing I noticed were the eyes. They were completely black and not like a normal person's eyes, which was probably the scariest part. I could also see definition all over its body, like visible muscles under the skin, especially on the arms and chest, but in a very lean way like a long-distance runner. I didn't have the mental capacity to understand what was in front of me, and this wave hit me that was like nothing I had ever felt before. It was actual terror because anyone would have known instantly this was not a human being. Then this thing turned toward me and we locked eyes. It felt like it lasted so long, but it was probably only a few seconds and neither one of us moved a muscle. Then it just stepped off the backside of the stump like a person would and it disappeared behind it. This scared me so much that I fully panicked and every cell in my body told me to run, and I listened. All I remember is turning around toward the lake and booking down the hill so fast that my heels were hitting my backside. I ran all the way to the water, then kept going around that whole side of the lake and to our campsite. Luckily, I used to be in good shape because I didn't stop once. When I finally got to camp, I was damn near hyperventilating and begging my dad to help me. I was yelling and trying to get the words out about what happened, and it was a whole big scene. I'm sure they thought I had been attacked by something because they were all genuinely freaked out. My dad got me to calm down, and I was finally able to tell him exactly what I had seen. His friend Mark kept asking if it was a person that I didn't get a good look at, but I must have described it well enough to scare my dad because he grabbed his pistol and left with Dave to the other side of the lake. Later on, Dave let me know my dad was on a mission to seriously hurt somebody because he thought there was a person out there that had done something to me. While they were gone, I stayed with Mark, who was an offensive lineman in college and a huge guy, but he was also very laid back, so it was nice to have him there. We were talking about it and he said something to me that I've never forgotten. In his opinion, based on my details, it sounded like I was describing an alien. That was like a light bulb being turned on because he was right. It looked exactly like an alien. I just hadn't come to that conclusion yet. Mark sat with me the whole time they were gone, which was probably about a half hour or 45 minutes. When they did make it back, my dad said they didn't see anyone or anything over there, which wasn't too surprising because they couldn't have known exactly where to look. I really wish they would have seen what I saw though. I didn't want any of them to think I was making it up. That trip was on my mind almost daily for a long time, and I thought about it so many times through high school. Mark's comments might have been the catalyst, but I became convinced I saw an alien, and I still strongly believe that today. The reason I feel so sure about it is because of the meteor we saw come down. The location where I was walking around and where I saw this thing in the woods was so close that there has to be a connection. Also, aliens and UFO sightings became way more mainstream as I got older, and hearing other people describe what they saw only solidified my own beliefs. It is exactly what I saw in the woods. I no longer care who thinks I'm telling the truth and who doesn't. It is a fact that I saw something non-human on that camping trip. I think the scariest part to me now is knowing that it saw me too. When I was little, a friend of my dad's would occasionally stay at our house with me as kind of a babysitter, and over the years I got to know him really well. I'm going to call him John because I don't know how he would feel about me sharing this publicly. My mom wasn't around when I was growing up, so my dad did everything and he had to rely on other people to look after me when he wasn't home. As I got older, John became more like a friend than a guardian, and he told me a story about something that happened to him, and it's probably one of the scariest things I've ever heard. Since I've talked to him about this many times, I feel like I can tell the story pretty accurately, and this is how it goes. John was a truck driver, and when he was younger, the company he worked for had him on a route that went through southeastern Oregon. He never told me exactly where this happened, but I know he was coming up from Nevada, and he always made it sound like there was nothing out there for 100 miles in every direction. This specific route also had an early morning delivery, so he was driving through the night. About 30 minutes past the border into Oregon, he saw the entire sky light up like it was daytime. He says that this was so intense he instantly hit the brakes and stopped the truck and had no idea what was going on. At its peak, he could see everything in detail, from the brush and grasses on the side of the road all the way to the surrounding hills in the distance. It only lasted seconds though, then it went back to total darkness. He only thought about two things after this happened. It was either a giant meteor or a nuclear bomb, and I guess he tucked himself down under the steering wheel and actually braced for whatever might happen. He was honestly waiting for a huge explosion from one of those two things, but nothing ever happened. He never heard anything other than his truck idling. He still stayed hunkered down until he felt safe, then finally got back on the road and just went with the idea it must have been a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. Only a couple of miles up the road, he got to a car with its hazard lights on. It was stopped and taking up most of the lane because there wasn't much of a shoulder on the two-lane highway. This made him stop too, but he said he left some distance between them in case he had to go around. He could see that the front end of the car was crumpled on one side like they had hit something, so he figured it was a deer. Then he got out to see if everyone was okay, but left his truck running with the headlights on. As he walked up to the car, he only saw one person, which was a younger man sitting on the ground by the passenger side door. He had his knees up into his chest with his arms around them, and his head was down like he could be injured or in shock. John yelled to him from about 20 feet away and asked if he was okay. This is where he tells me that he got a really weird feeling about the situation and listened to his gut by not getting too close. The only response from this guy was, "My head is killing me," mixed with some groaning noises, and he didn't even look up, so it was muffled. Then John asked him if he had hit a deer and got the same reply about his head hurting, but that time he asked for help. Since there was a fully stocked first aid kit in the truck, John started to believe the guy, but he wanted to get a better look at what kind of injuries he might have, so he ignored his gut and walked closer. Then he noticed something else, and this scared me so much the first time I heard the story. He said that something was seriously wrong with the car. It looked fake, like a prop car you'd use in a movie, if that makes sense. It had all the major parts and angles to look like a car, but nothing else. There was no rear license plate, and the whole back of the car looked like one piece where the trunk was just lines and not a real functional trunk. It did have taillights on it, but no car company logo or any kind of badging. He walked around to the driver's side and said that the car either had no windows or all of them were rolled down because there was no glass in any of the 4 doors. Then he leaned forward to look inside and hit his breaking point. Even though the only light was coming from his truck's headlights, it was enough for him to plainly see that the car had no interior. There were no seats in the front or the back and no dashboard. It was completely empty inside, and this was his cue to leave immediately. As he was backing himself toward the truck, the man asked for help again, and it was in a louder, more desperate tone. John decided to give him a solid answer and told him to sit tight while he got his first aid kit, and also mentioned that he'd try to radio for help. He wasn't actually going to do either of those things because he knew this was some kind of setup for a robbery or even worse. He was only trying to make it back to his truck. The last thing John heard him say was, "I have a concussion, please help me." Then as he got behind the car again, he had a clear view of the guy who was still sitting on the ground, but I guess he finally lifted his head up off of his knees and looked directly at John. When he did this, his face was in the truck's headlights. John says that his eyes and mouth were grotesque and totally out of place with the rest of his face. The way he describes it is that the main parts and features looked like they were upside down, and this was in bright light, so it wasn't angles or shadows making it look like that. John jumped back into his rig and locked the doors. Then as he started driving forward and trying to maneuver the truck around the left side of the car, it turned into a true life or death situation. This guy climbed onto the passenger door of the truck and was holding onto the mirror while banging on the glass and trying to open the door. John says it was the scariest moment of his life. As this was happening, he grabbed a short little baseball bat or billy club that he kept next to the seat and waved it at the guy through the window while yelling at him. Apparently, this did make him stop banging on the window, but John says before the guy let go of the truck, it looked like he was screaming with his horrific-looking mouth, but it was in the opposite direction toward the car, almost like it was meant for someone else out there that could have been hiding off the road. He finally jumped off, and John says he clipped the back of the car on his way around it, which pushed it sideways and into the dirt shoulder. Then he drove away as fast as his truck would go. It took him miles to stop thinking there was someone secretly hanging on the back of his truck, but he didn't stop or even slow down until he got to his destination, which was this small town called Burns. Fortunately, he made it without any other problems, but he actually left that job after this happened. That's how much it scared him. He did report this to the police up in Oregon with all the details and the location, and he let the company know what had happened too, but he never got an answer or even a follow-up call from anyone. He doubts that the police even sent someone out there to check that section of the highway because it was pretty far away from Burns. My dad knows this story just as well as I do, and he thinks it was a group of people trying to stop the truck and steal whatever was in it. That sounds possible on the surface, but it doesn't account for the massive nuclear-level flash that lit up the entire area. John, on the other hand, is adamant that what he saw was something trying to look human and doing a terrible job at it. He has told me right to my face that nothing on this world looks like what he saw. Years after he told me this story, and by total chance, John was at my dad's house while I was there. I just so happened to be scrolling through Facebook and saw a post about something called the Thatcher Effect, and it grabbed my short attention span. It was showing celebrities' faces upside down, which looked totally normal to me. Then next to that, there was the same exact picture but right side up, and they looked horribly distorted because the eyes and mouth had been flipped in Photoshop. You can look this up if you want a visual because it's kind of hard to explain, but basically our brains don't recognize the flipped features when the whole face is inverted, but when you flip it back to normal, it looks hideous. It's a very weird illusion, and after I saw that post, I showed my dad and John, who were right next to me. John absolutely freaked out when he saw it. He said the man's face during his experience in Oregon looked so close to those flipped faces that he almost couldn't look at them. None of us had ever heard of this Thatcher Effect before that moment, but now that I have a better idea of what he actually saw out there, his story is even more terrifying to me. I had an experience at my home in Foster, Rhode Island that I feel is related to the stories you share. I'm going to keep my name out because a lot of people know me in this community and I would rather they keep thinking of me the way they always have. But what happened changed my life in a very positive way. I live by myself in the same house my husband and I shared for 38 years. He passed away 6 years ago, but my sister lives here and I see my kids and my grandkids often, so I'm not lonely in that way. We have a lot of property, and over the years, my husband and I established quite the garden space that some people might even call a small farm. Working in our garden has always been a big part of my life, but it became the central point after he was gone. I grow much more food than I can use and love sharing it with my neighbors and family. On a completely ordinary night, I went to my room with a cup of chamomile tea and a book like I usually do before going to sleep. Somewhere in my reading, I must have fallen asleep because I was startled awake by someone's voice outside my bedroom window. Just outside, there are rows of raised garden beds that sit against the house, and it sounded like that's where it was coming from. I got out of bed and went over to the window, then heard the voice again, and it clearly said my name. There should never be anyone out there, but what really shocked me was that the voice sounded like my husband calling me. It was exactly the same actually, and I hadn't heard his voice in years. I don't know how lucid I was since I had just woken up, but I put my slippers on and walked down the hallway toward our dining room where I could get a clear view of the back through the patio doors. About halfway down the hall, my entire house filled with light, and I can't describe how bright it was. It was overflowing into every room and it stopped me in my tracks. I wasn't even near a window and it still lit up everything around me. This only lasted a few seconds, then it went away and got dark again. I kept going to the end of the hall where I could lean around the corner, and when I looked out the back doors, there was a man standing on our patio with the garden hose, casually watering the flower beds. I couldn't see his face because he was turned the other way, but the shape of him was a spitting image of my husband. Even his posture was the same, and he used to stand there and water those same beds all the time. As strange and possibly as scary as that might sound, I walked right up to the sliding glass door and looked at him. I was in total disbelief that he was standing 10 feet away from me and consciously telling myself it wasn't possible. Then I lifted the piece of doweling out of the track that I use as my security system, opened the door and said his name. When he turned around and faced me, it was definitely him, but oddly enough, I didn't run over to put my arms around him or anything, which I still think is weird. Instead, I went out on the patio without saying a word, and when we got close, all he said was, "Let's take a walk through the garden," and then we started walking together. He did most of the talking, but it wasn't like any conversation we'd ever had in real life. He kept pointing specific things out to me, like our tomato plants and the soil they were growing in, and a big rock that had been in our yard for years. Each time he pointed to something around us, he would tell me I was connected to it. One that I really remember was the raised beds. He took my hand and put it on the wood and told me I was literally connected to the cedar trees they were made from, as in we were two parts of the same thing and all from the same place. When he said that, I could feel it physically. I don't know how to explain it really, but just hearing the words "you are part of this" made me feel what it was like to be that thing for just a moment. It was the strangest thing, but in a very calm and certain way, like he was reminding me of a simple fact that I had forgotten. After making a loop around the inner part of our garden, we got back to the door and he told me I should go to bed. I don't understand why, but I didn't question that. I just walked in the house and didn't even say goodbye. Something changed when I turned around to lock the door though. I saw him walking away toward our greenhouse, but it didn't look like my husband anymore. The shape of the body was completely different and much taller than he was by at least a foot. Then it dawned on me that what I was looking at was not my husband and it wasn't a person. It was exactly what people describe as an alien, like the kind you see in movies or on TV. It had to be in the mid 6-foot range and its body looked fit and slim, especially up into the shoulders. It also had a larger head but not disproportionate to its body. It never turned around again, so I only saw it from behind, but I am positive this is what I saw. I realized while I was standing there that I hadn't been talking to my husband. I had been talking to some kind of other living being the whole time. The only memory I have after this is walking back down the hall toward my room. I do not remember getting into my bed or going to sleep. I just woke up in the morning with my book next to me on the comforter. This experience really stayed with me afterward, as I'm sure it would with most people. I also didn't dare tell anyone and kept it completely to myself, but as the days and weeks went on, something started happening to me. When I would be working in my garden, I would feel that same sense of connection to things, and it was very strong. I could put my hands on a plant or a tree, or even my bucket, and feel like I was part of it. Please do not think I'm some kind of hippie when I say that, because it's so far from who I am. This was totally new for me. It didn't stop with the garden either. There was a morning where I was at my table eating oatmeal and toast for breakfast, and I felt the same connection to the food. It was in the individual oats and the grains in the bread and even the juice I was drinking. It continued happening for months and got even stronger, like something was telling me I needed to go out of my way to take care of the world. It eventually led me to spending my time and money differently, and I joined a group that cleans up parks and roads, which was something I had never been involved in before. It's not like I didn't care about the environment before this happened. I know everyone does to some extent, but it was different, like a calling or a responsibility. I don't think what happened to me was in any way paranormal. I can't imagine my husband's spirit visiting me from the other side to chat about the environment, then turning into an alien before leaving. That doesn't make any sense. I also don't think it was a dream because of how real it was and how much it changed my life. The only thing that seems to fit is that I had an encounter with another life form. I don't know if it was from here or from somewhere totally different, but whatever it was, it gave me a clear message. We are connected to all of this, and we need to take care of it like it's irreplaceable. And that is exactly how I live my life now. In 2010, I was working at a hotel on Lake Junaluska in western North Carolina. I lived about 15 minutes away in Waynesville and usually worked a pretty normal schedule, but one night I ended up getting off late because of a coworker who had gone home sick. When I left work, I got onto the road that runs between the building and the lake, which is Lakeshore Drive, and there were no other cars or people out anywhere. I was only a few seconds down that road when I saw something out on the water that was so out of place it made me slow down to just a mile or two an hour to look at it. From where I was on the road, it looked like an old wooden boat with very sharp angles and a faint ring of light around the bottom of it. That's about the only way I can describe it. It kind of had this small pirate ship shape to it, but a little wider and flatter, and it seemed to have some kind of platform around the bottom of it at the water level. This was a very weird thing to see because the only boats with motors allowed on that lake are tour boats, so I've never seen anything like it on the water. What was most confusing was the light around the bottom because it wasn't coming from the boat itself. It was underwater, and I could tell because it was blurry, like it was coming up through the water and barely lighting the boat from underneath. I ended up stopping my car in the middle of the road and rolling my side window down so I could have the clearest view of what was going on. I think I was mainly trying to understand why anyone would be out there with a boat like that so late at night. Then as I was watching this, the light underneath got noticeably brighter and started moving around the boat in a circle. I would probably compare the level of light to be that of a car's headlights, so it wasn't too bright, and the way it was circling the boat made it look like it was on a track underwater. I also noticed it was going faster each time it went around, and it kept speeding up like that until it got to the point where I couldn't tell it was moving anymore. It just looked like a solid circle of light underneath. Right when it got to that point, and this is hard for me to even say, I saw the boat lift straight out of the water and into the air. I would guess that it only came up 10 or 15 feet above the surface when the light underneath went completely dark. Even without that light, I could still see the whole thing. It was just a little harder to make out. Then I realized that the part I had been looking at on top of the water wasn't the whole thing, and a little more than half of it had been underwater the entire time. It was too dark to see any details, but the overall size was more than twice as big as I thought it was. This thing kept going into the air until it probably got to 100 or 200 feet. Then it started to move away from the lake and over a small hill that's on the other side. I should also mention that I still had my window down, and the only thing I heard during this was the sound of water falling back down to the lake when it lifted up. Everything else was silent. After it had gone over the hill, I decided to get out of the road and pulled into a parking spot. That whole side of the road has spaces where you can park, and every space looks directly at the lake. I shut my headlights off and sat in the dark for at least 10 minutes waiting to see if anything else was going to happen. I was really in a state of awe and my adrenaline was pumping, but unfortunately it never came back over the hill. It actually took me a while to accept everything, probably because it was so unnatural. I could not believe that I had just seen this thing that I couldn't even begin to identify, and I watched it basically break the laws of physics right in front of me. I don't know what time I finally left or even how late it was when I got home. I wasn't paying attention to any of that. I really only remember looking out the windows all the way home and trying to see it again. My husband got every detail when I was back at the house, and he was just as dumbfounded as I was. I will also say that he didn't try to explain it away or tell me I was exaggerating. He was all ears and couldn't believe what I had seen. I love him for that, since I had no idea how he was going to react when I told him. I think there are only 3 or 4 other people outside of my husband that know about this. For a while I wanted to say something when I was at the hotel, but I never did. The community up there has a pretty deep religious history. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm a Christian myself, but I wasn't that close to any of my coworkers, and it never felt like the place to bring it up. One thing I find so interesting is that before this happened, you could have asked me to sketch up 1,000 different pictures of what I thought a UFO might look like, and not one of them would look like what I saw. It was way too strange. Nothing about it matches any of the sightings and crafts I've heard other people describe, and the way it lifted out of the water and floated away shouldn't be possible. Of course, I have a lot of questions like anyone would. One that I think about a lot though is if it had been hiding in the lake and came up from underwater, or if it had come down for a few minutes before I got off work and I just happened to catch it leaving. It's not a very deep lake, so I'm guessing it must have come down from somewhere, but I don't really know. Either way, it completely amazes me that I was at that exact place on the road at that exact time. Three years ago in October, my friend Steve took me out to ride the Wasatch Crest Trail in Utah, or what he calls the Crest. It was probably the first true big mountain ride I'd ever done, but he lives in Park City and knew the trail well. I was super excited because the fall colors were peaking, but I was also a little nervous about a section of the trail called the Spine, which is a very rocky and technical ridge that runs for maybe 500 feet with big drops on both sides. When we got to that part of the trail, I was behind Steve, mainly focused on following his line because it's not very forgiving. He was just ahead of me when I saw him come to a dead stop at a pretty precarious spot. It really wasn't somewhere you'd want to stop unless something was wrong, so I hit my brakes hard and just about ran into the back of him. I asked what was up and he just pointed off to our left and mumbled about something, but I couldn't hear him. Then he finally turned toward me and said he saw something shoot into the air from the bottom of the canyon that looked like a silver telephone pole. That is exactly what he said. Literally 10 seconds after that, it happened again and we both saw it. Something came straight up from the valley floor below the left side of the trail, and it was perfectly vertical, like it launched right out of the earth. The weirdest part was it looked exactly like what Steve had described, a big metal pole, and it went up into the sky. You could see that it was shiny and reflective, and it must have gone thousands of feet into the air until we couldn't see it anymore. It was easy to see when it was lower and had land behind it, but when it got higher, it was a lot harder to track. We didn't even have time to ask each other what was going on when we saw 2 more of them go up at almost the same time. One was just barely higher than the other, but they both did the exact same thing. This was right about the time I noticed that we weren't hearing anything. I think my subconscious was expecting a boom or a rocket launch sound, but all of these things had been silent. At that point, we were standing over our bikes in shock. I was trying to look down at the bottom of the ridge to figure out where they were coming from. Then 2 more took off, and these ones were a lot farther away from each other, so they had to have come from different starting points. They were probably a 1/4 mile apart. Both of them did the same thing and flew straight up like missiles, but that time we got a pretty good look at the closer one. I cannot come up with a better description than highly polished metal telephone poles. It's just exactly what they looked like. My best guess is that they were about 40 feet long with a 2-foot diameter, and we couldn't even fathom what they might be. Right after those 2 went up, we laid our bikes down and Steve started dumping his Camelback out into the dirt. I was standing there telling him it had to be the military, like missile or weapons testing, but that didn't make much sense since we weren't hearing anything. Then 1 more of these things went up and I watched it for as long as I possibly could, but the same thing happened where it got to a certain altitude and you just couldn't keep track of it after that. It really looked like they were going up forever. That was the last one we saw. I wasn't paying attention, but Steve had been emptying his bag to get his phone out. When he finally got it, he stood there waiting for another one so he could get a picture or a video, but everything had happened too fast. He didn't get anything and was pretty pissed off about it. The truth is though, I don't know how anyone would have been able to catch it because there was this initial minute of questioning what they even were, and when he finally thought to get his phone out, it was over. While Steve was shoving his stuff back into his backpack, we heard people yelling at us. It turned out to be the 2 guys who had been ahead of us, and they were just past the spine where it flattens out a little. We could hear them asking if we had seen it, so we hopped back on our bikes and rode down to them. Both of these guys had seen the same thing we did. They had only caught the last 3 that went up, but at least there were other witnesses and we weren't the only ones. After talking to them, we realized the most frustrating part of the whole thing. Between all of us, we had 4 perfectly working smartphones with incredible cameras on them, but since they had all been stowed away in backpacks, not one of us had gotten a picture or a video of it happening. Like I said before, there just wasn't any time to think, and the whole thing only lasted a minute from start to finish. Literally 60 seconds, and that was it. They just kept launching into the air right in a row, then it was over. Steve and I tried to cross-check our memory to figure out how many there were, and it was 7 in total. The first one only he saw, then we both saw the second one. After that, there were the 2 separate pairs that went up, and finally the one at the end. 7 of these things had launched in roughly 1 minute. We ended up talking to those guys for a while, and none of us had a clue what they could have been or where they were coming from down in the canyon. No one had ever seen anything like it. I always tell people to picture telephone poles made out of solid polished metal, then imagine those being shot vertically into the sky at the speed of a rocket. It was truly one of the most impossible sights you can imagine. There is one thing I've thought about as far as where they could have been coming from, but it could be totally wrong. I wonder if somehow they were taking off from this little lake that sits at the bottom of the canyon on that side. I did look down there while it was happening, but I didn't see any disturbance or ripples on the surface. It could be a possibility though. I don't have any explanation, but I know at least 4 people saw this happen. I still get extremely disappointed that no one caught it on camera, and that's really changed me. I now have a rule where I always keep my phone in the outside pocket of my backpack. It's not as protected if I take a fall, but I like knowing I can instantly reach back and grab it if I ever need to again. I've had a memory of something for as long as I can remember, and it ties into a later experience I had when I was in high school. It'll probably sound strange and might not make perfect sense, but I'll try to explain it the best I can. The early part is a little hazy because I was so young, but I believe it all comes together into one bigger picture. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I had this friend who would come and visit me at night. I'm doing air quotes when I say the word friend too, just so you know. I don't remember meeting this friend, and I don't know where he would come from. I only remember being in my bedroom and hearing him tapping on my window. Every time this happened, I would look up and see his fingers on the glass. That has always stuck with me because it's kind of a disturbing detail in hindsight. He would also tap like he was trying not to wake anyone else up. It was just for me. My window didn't have a screen on it, so when he would tap on the glass, I would climb onto my desk, slide it open, and go outside with him. This is one of the strangest parts because that window is a good 6 feet off the ground outside, and I was a little kid. I don't know how I got out without hurting myself or how I got back in. This happened occasionally for about a year, then it stopped when I hit 5th grade. I don't think there was a final visit or any kind of goodbye. I just noticed he wasn't coming anymore. After that, I lived my life and grew up like anybody else. The memories of it were always there, but by high school they were distant and I never connected them to anything. Then during my senior year, I had a bizarre mental problem pop up that is really hard for me to explain. I was only a few months away from being 18 and I started having these episodes where it felt like time slowed down. That's about the simplest way I can say it, but it's not totally accurate. I don't mean it as in the world around me actually slowed down. It was more like reality was moving along fine, but something happened in my head where I would briefly experience everything in this extreme slow motion. It was especially strong with words and talking too. It would always start with a quick but intense head rush that only lasted a second. There wasn't any pain or dizziness, it was just a quick rush out of nowhere. Right after that, everything would feel extremely slow, including my inner monologue. In my head, I would say to myself, "What is this?" or "It's happening again," and those words would draw out so slowly and sometimes they would repeat several times in a row. There was no rhyme or reason to it and no trigger that I ever found. I could be anywhere doing anything and it was completely random. The first time it happened, I honestly thought it was the beginning of a seizure or something like that, but nothing ever happened outside of the slow motion sensation. And when I was in the middle of it, I could look around, move freely, and talk perfectly fine. The only abnormal thing was the incredibly slow pace of everything around me. Then the episode would end and I would feel completely normal again. I want to be really clear about something too. I didn't think the world had actually slowed down. I knew I was just perceiving it that way, and I was the only one. It felt like I was outside of time somehow and watching it go by much more slowly. That might not make sense, but there just isn't an easy way to explain it. Each time I experienced this, it would only last seconds, maybe 15 to 30 at the most, and at first it really scared me. After 3 or 4 times though, I realized the best thing I could do was relax and not fight it, so I would just sit there and let it happen, and when I did that, it would pass and I'd feel fine. These episodes were never followed by a headache or confusion or anything else. It would just be over. In total, I'm guessing it happened 50 times or more during my senior year. I never said a word to my parents because how would I even explain something like that? I also didn't want them to take me to some psychiatrist, so basically I just dealt with it. After graduation, it was summer and I was trying to find a job. This was back when you actually had to go into places and ask for paper applications. One afternoon, I had gone to 4 or 5 different places collecting applications, then brought them home, sat on the couch and started filling them out on the coffee table. I had my head down with a pen in my hand when that familiar head rush hit me again. It hadn't happened in a while, so it caught me off guard a little, but I knew exactly what it was. I remember lifting my head up, and as soon as I did, everything around me had that slow feeling. In my mind, I said something like, "Just let it pass," and that sentence kept repeating over and over, extremely slow and drawn out. I tried to relax and leaned against the back of the couch, or at least I started to. Then I looked around the living room. I vividly remember moving my eyes across the room from right to left. When I got over to the left side of the room, I saw the tall fake plant that my mom had sitting in the corner, and about a foot in front of that was something standing in my living room less than 10 feet away from me. When I actually saw what this was, I felt my soul leave my body. That's probably the best way I can describe the feeling it gave me. I knew instantly it was real, and it wasn't like the slow motion feeling in my head. This was not a hallucination or any kind of waking dream. It was a living, physical being in the room looking at me. While our eyes were locked onto each other, I knew 2 things undeniably. The first thing was that I was looking at an alien in every sense of the word. It was exactly what people describe when they talk about a gray alien. I hate even saying that because it sounds so commercial and fake, but that's exactly what it was, a textbook gray alien. The second thing was that I knew, and I mean I knew with everything in me, that this was who used to come to my window when I was young. It all seemed to come together perfectly, and in a fraction of a second, I was looking at my friend. Another crazy part about this moment is that I was beyond terrified, but there was also this feeling of familiarity, like I knew this being and we'd known each other my whole life, but just hadn't seen each other in a long time. It's really hard for me to explain that part too. All I can say is that I was utterly overwhelmed with fear and emotion, and I couldn't process the situation, so I closed my eyes and leaned into the couch. I remember feeling my back hit the cushion, and that physical sensation on my skin was enough to kind of ground me and make the slow motion feeling end. After that, I gradually started to feel normal again. It took me a few seconds, but when I opened my eyes, the living room was empty and it looked fine. My sense of time was okay, and there was nothing in front of the plant. It was just me alone on the couch with a job application in front of me. My behavior after this was very unusual. I didn't jump up or run out of the house like I would imagine myself doing. I didn't even call my parents, who were both still at work that day. I just stayed on the couch and thought about how my life would never be the same, and I didn't know what to do with that. Deep in my soul, I knew that I had been visited since I was a kid. I still didn't know what happened during those visits, but at least I knew what they were. I also had a very strong sense that what happened in my living room was a goodbye of sorts. That's what it felt like to me. I want to say that this being showed itself to me one time and fully, so I could finally understand what had been going on. Don't get me wrong, it was still terrifying, and that's why I closed my eyes. But after the fact, when I'd had some time to sit with it, it didn't feel bad in any way. I understood that it was never trying to hurt me. Back then, I wasn't a believer or a non-believer. It just wasn't something I ever thought about. But after coming face to face with something that I knew was not from here, there was no going back. Since that day, I've known with absolute certainty that we are not alone. I don't have any idea why certain people have encounters and others don't, and who knows why they chose me. I'm not special in any way. I only know that it happened, and it's something I silently carry around with me every day.